Picture this. It's 1347, and a respected monk named Brother Aldrich is stumbling through the stone corridors of his monastery in southern France, giggling uncontrollably. His eyes are bloodshot, his pupils dilated like saucers, and he's mumbling something about angels dancing on the head of a pin while he tries to remember where he left his prayer book. The abbot finds him 3 hours later, passed out in the herb garden, clutching a bundle of ergot-infected rye, like it's the Holy Grail itself. When he wakes up, Brother Aldrich swears he's seen the face of God, had a conversation with St. Peter, and watched the devil himself do a little jig on the chapel roof down. Before you think this is just some one-off incident of a monk having a bad day, let me blow your mind with this. Medieval people were getting absolutely blitzed on a regular basis. And I'm not just talking about wine at communion. We're talking about substances that would make a modern-day raver think twice. The Middle Ages. They weren't just dark and dreary. They were trippy, wild, and honestly, way more lit than your high school history teacher ever let on. And here's the kicker that's gonna make you question everything you thought you knew about medieval times. Some of the most powerful people in Europe, kings, queens, bishops, and knights, were regularly consuming mind-altering substances, and it wasn't even considered weird. It was medicine. It was religion. It was Tuesday. Before we dive deep into this absolutely bonkers journey through medieval pharmacology, do me a solid and smash that subscribe button for dreamless timelines. We're about to go on a trip literally and figuratively, and trust me, you're gonna want to stick around for every wild minute of this story. Drop a like if you've ever wondered what people did for fun before Netflix. And comment below if you think you could survive getting high medieval style. Spoiler alert, you probably couldn't, so let's rewind the clock about 700 years and step into a world where the line between medicine, magic, and getting absolutely zonked was thinner than a communion wafer. The year is 1289, and in a small village outside of Paris, a woman named Marguerite is preparing what she calls her special remedy. Her husband, Pierre, has been complaining of tooth pain for 3 days straight, moaning and groaning so loud that even the chickens in the yard are sick of hearing about it. Marguerite, who learned her craft from her grandmother, who learned it from her grandmother, is about to mix up something that would make a modern DEA agent's head spin faster than a possession victim at an exorcism. She starts with a base of wine, because of course she does. This is medieval Europe, where water is basically a death sentence waiting to happen. Then she adds mandrake root, which she dug up at midnight during the last full moon while saying a prayer to Saint Apollonia, the patron saint of toothaches. She throws in some henbane seeds, a pinch of opium poppy extract that she traded a basket of eggs for at the last market, and just for good measure, some hemlock, but not too much. Because Socrates already showed everyone how that particular experiment ends. Pierre drinks this concoction, and within 20 minutes, homeboy is on a completely different astral plane. The tooth pain, gone. His ability to feel his own face, also gone. His certainty that he's having a deep philosophical conversation with the family goat, absolutely present and accounted for. This wasn't unusual. This was healthcare.c. Here's what they don't teach you in school. Medieval people had access to some seriously powerful psychoactive substances, and they used them for everything from childbirth to surgery to making Sunday Mass a little more interesting. The medieval pharmacopoeia was basically a greatest hits album of naturally occurring drugs, and people were mixing and matching them like a sketchy DJ at an underground rave. Let's talk about the big players in the medieval getting high game, because this roster is absolutely stacked. First up, we've got opium, the heavyweight champion of medieval pain relief. The opium poppy had been cultivated since ancient times, and by the Middle Ages, Europeans were well versed in its use. Monks grew it in monastery gardens right next to the carrots and turnips, Doctors prescribed it for everything from headaches to heartbreak. The medieval writer Hildegard of Bingen was basically the Martha Stewart of the 12th century, if Martha Stewart was a nun who wrote about mystical visions and herbal medicine. Wrote extensively about poppy's uses. But here's where it gets interesting. They didn't just use opium for pain. Oh no, that would be too straightforward. They mixed it into these wild concoctions called soporifics or sleeping potions that were used for surgery. Imagine being a medieval surgeon and your patient is about to have a leg amputated because of gangrene. You can't just knock them out with modern anesthesia. So instead, you give them what was called a soporific sponge, a sea sponge soaked in a mixture of opium, mandrake, hemlock, and henbane, then dried and stored until needed. When surgery time came, they'd moisten the sponge with hot water, hold it under the patient's nose, and boom, lights out. The formula for one of these bad boys, recorded in a 13th century manuscript, reads like a recipe for absolutely wrecking someone's entire evening. 1 part opium, 1 part mandrake, a dash of ivy, some lettuce seeds because apparently medieval pharmacists thought salad ingredients belonged in anesthesia, and enough henbane to knock out a horse. The patient would inhale the fumes and drift off into what was presumably a very weird dream involving dancing skeletons and talking animals. But opium was just the opening act. Let's talk about ergot, which is where things get properly insane. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye and other grains. It looks like little purple-black growths on the grain stalks. And it contains lysergic acid, the same compound that centuries later would be synthesized into LSD. That's right, medieval people were accidentally dosing themselves with nature's answer to acid. And they had no clue what was happening. When people ate bread made from ergotine-fected rye, they developed something called St. Anthony's fire or ergotism. The symptoms: hallucinations, convulsions, the sensation that your limbs were burning from the inside out, and in severe cases, gangrene that caused fingers and toes to literally fall off. Fun times, but here's the thing that'll bake your noodle. Some historians believe that small, controlled doses of ergot were deliberately used for their psychoactive properties. Midwives used it to induce labor because it caused powerful uterine contractions. Some monks and mystics may have used tiny amounts to induce religious visions. The line between medicinal dose and trip balls into the stratosphere was thinner than parchment, and crossing it was easier than falling off a log. There are accounts from medieval villages where entire communities would be affected by ergot poisoning at once. Picture this. Everyone in a small French village starts having the same hallucinations because they all ate bread from the same contaminated batch of rye. One person sees demons. Another sees angels. A third is convinced they can fly and has to be physically restrained from jumping off the church tower. The priest is trying to perform an exorcism, but plot twist, he also ate the bread. So now he's convinced the communion wine is talking to him. This happened multiple times throughout the Middle Ages. In 1518, in Strasbourg, there was an incident called the Dancing Plague where people danced uncontrollably for days. Some of them dancing until they literally died from exhaustion. While historians debate the exact cause, ergot poisoning is one of the leading theories. Imagine being so high that you dance yourself to death, and you can't stop because your brain chemistry has been completely hijacked by a fungus. That's metal as hell. Now let's talk about mandrake, because this plant deserves its own chapter in the plants that'll mess you up. Encyclopedia. Mandrake root contains tropane alkaloids, the same compounds found in deadly nightshade, henbane, and datura. These substances cause delirium, hallucinations, and a disconnection from reality that would make a Silicon Valley microdosing enthusiast weep with envy. But what made mandrake special in the medieval imagination was its shape. The root often grew in a vaguely humanoid form, with what looked like arms and legs branching off from a central body. This led to all sorts of wild folklore. People believed that mandrake plants screamed when pulled from the ground, and that hearing this scream would drive you insane or kill you outright. The solution: tie a dog to the plant and have the dog pull it up, thereby sacrificing Fido for the sake of your magical root collection. I'm not making this up. This is in multiple medieval texts. Once you had your mandrake root, assuming you and your dog both survived the extraction, you could use it for all sorts of purposes, ground into powder and mixed with wine. It was an anesthetic. Worn as an amulet, it supposedly brought luck and prosperity. Placed under your pillow, it was said to induce prophetic dreams. What it actually did was get you high as a kite and make you hallucinate that you could see the future. A woman named Agnes in 14th century England was brought before the church courts for having a mandrake root carved to look like a tiny person, which she kept in a box and fed with wine and bread. She claimed it helped her predict when customers would come to her shop. The church called it witchcraft. Modern pharmacologists would call it being under the influence of tropane alkaloids. Agnes probably just called it good business sense. Medieval surgeons used mandrake as part of their anesthetic cocktails, but they had to be careful. Too little and the patient would wake up mid-surgery, screaming their head off while you're elbow deep in their abdomen. Too much and they'd never wake up at all, which was decidedly bad for repeat business. The medieval surgeon's guide to dosing was basically pray you get it right and maybe sacrifice a candle to St. Luke just to be safe. Henbane is another player in this pharmaceutical free-for-all, and it's nasty stuff. It causes hallucinations, agitation, seizures, and death, in that order if you're not careful. But in small doses, it was used for everything from toothaches to insomnia. Medieval beer brewers sometimes added henbane to their brew to make it more potent and intoxicating, which explains a lot about medieval tavern behavior. Honestly, there are accounts of people drinking henbane-laced beer and becoming convinced they could perform incredible feats of strength. One guy apparently tried to lift a cart horse over his head. He could not, in fact, lift a cart horse over his head. But the henbane made him absolutely certain he could. Right up until the moment the horse kicked him in the chest. Flying ointments, yes. That's what they were actually called, were another medieval mindbender. These were salves made from various psychoactive plants like henbane, belladonna, and aconite, mixed with fat and rubbed on the skin. The alkaloids would absorb through the skin and into the bloodstream, causing hallucinations and the sensation of flying or transforming into animals. This is where the image of witches flying on broomsticks probably comes from. Women accused of witchcraft often confessed under torture to using flying ointments and attending sabbats where they flew through the air. But here's the thing. If you rub a paste of henbane, belladonna, and aconite on your body, you absolutely will hallucinate that you're flying. You'll also probably wake up in a ditch 3 miles from home with no memory of how you got there, and a nasty rash, but the flying sensation is real enough to your scrambled brain. Medieval people also got high from the most unexpected sources. Nutmeg, for instance, which was a luxury spice imported from the East, contains myristicin, a compound that causes hallucinations in large doses. At medieval feasts among the wealthy, nutmeg was sprinkled liberally on dishes, and while it's unlikely anyone was eating enough to trip, there are accounts of people becoming dizzy and disoriented after particularly spice-heavy meals. The wealthy elite had access to substances from all over the known world through trade routes. Cannabis was known in medieval Europe, though it was more commonly used for making rope and textiles than for getting stoned. However, it definitely made its way into some medicinal preparations, particularly for pain relief and inflammation. Hey, quick pause in our journey through medieval pharmacology to say, if you're enjoying this trip through history, pun absolutely intended, make sure you hit that like button and drop a comment letting me know which medieval substance sounds the wildest to you. And seriously, Subscribe to Dreamless Timelines if you haven't already. We've got so much more bizarre history to uncover together, and you won't want to miss it. Now, let's talk about who exactly was getting high in medieval times. Because the answer is pretty much everyone, but in very different ways, depending on their social class. Peasants and common folk relied on locally available plants and folk remedies passed down through generations. That woman in the village who knew which herbs to gather and how to prepare them. She was basically the neighborhood pharmacist, therapist, and occasional dealer rolled into one. These women were called wise women, or cunning folk, and they walked a dangerous line between respected healer and suspected witch. Take the case of Alison Device, a woman in 17th century England. Okay, that's technically just past the medieval period, but bear with me because the practices were the same. Alison was known in her village for preparing remedies using plants like foxglove, belladonna, and hemlock. When used correctly, these could treat heart conditions, pain, and fever. When used incorrectly, they could cause hallucinations, convulsions, and death. Alison ended up accused of witchcraft and was executed, largely because people couldn't distinguish between her legitimate medicinal knowledge and supposed dark magic. The reality was that these village healers understood practical pharmacology in a way that was genuinely impressive. They knew that willow bark could reduce fever and pain because it contains salicylic acid, the precursor to aspirin. They knew that foxglove could regulate an irregular heartbeat because it contains digitalis. And they knew that certain combinations of plants could ease pain, induce sleep, or cause visions that might help diagnose illness through what they interpreted as divine insight. Monks and clergy had their own relationship with mind-altering substances. Monasteries had extensive herb gardens where they cultivated medicinal plants, including opium, poppies, mandrake, and various plants with psychoactive properties. They copied and preserved ancient texts on medicine and pharmacology, including works by Arabic physicians that describe the properties of various drugs. But here's where it gets spicy. Some monks and mystics may have deliberately used psychoactive substances to induce religious visions. There are accounts of monks experiencing ecstatic visions during long periods of fasting and prayer. But some historians suggest that ergot contamination of monastic bread stores combined with deliberate use of certain herbs could have contributed to these mystical experiences. Saint Hildegard of Bingen, whom I mentioned earlier, wrote about experiencing visions of divine light and hearing the voice of God. She also wrote extensively about herbs and their effects, including plants we now know to have psychoactive properties. Was she having genuine mystical experiences, or was she experiencing the effects of ergot, mandrake, or other substances? Maybe both. The medieval mind didn't distinguish between spiritual and chemical experiences the way we do now. Then there's the story of the Beguines. Communities of religious women in medieval Europe who weren't nuns but lived semi-monastic lives. They supported themselves through various crafts, including making herbal remedies. Some Beguines became known for producing particularly effective medicines, which may have included psychoactive ingredients. The church was deeply suspicious of these independent women, and many Beguines were accused of heresy or witchcraft. One Beguine named Marguerite Porret wrote a mystical text called The Mirror of Simple Souls, in which she described achieving union with God through a process of spiritual annihilation of the self. The church didn't like that one bit and burned her at the stake in 1310. But reading her descriptions of mystical experiences, you can't help but wonder if she had access to substances that facilitated those transcendent states. The nobility and royalty had access to the most exotic and expensive substances available. Through trade with the Middle East and Asia, they could obtain opium, hashish, and various spices with psychoactive properties. Court physicians, two kings and queens, prepared elaborate medicines that often included multiple mind-altering ingredients. Let's talk about a guy named Philippa of Hainault, Queen of England in the 14th century. When she was in labor with one of her many children, Her physicians gave her a preparation called a caudle, which was basically medieval pain relief in a cup. This particular caudle contained wine, ale, honey, egg yolks, and here's the kicker, generous amounts of opium and mandrake. The goal was to ease labor pains, but the side effect was that the queen was absolutely obliterated for most of her labor. She later said she remembered very little of the birth, which was probably the point. Medieval surgery is where the rubber really met the road in terms of mind-altering substances. Surgeons didn't have much in the way of anesthesia, so they relied heavily on what they called sleeping potions or dwale. Different recipes existed, but most included opium, hemlock, henbane, and various other plants mixed with wine or vinegar. One surgeon's manual from the 15th century describes the preparation process in detail. You had to gather the ingredients during specific phases of the moon while saying prayers. Whether the moon phases and prayers actually mattered is debatable, but the pharmacological cocktail certainly did. Patients who drank dwale before surgery would become unconscious or semi-conscious, feel little to no pain, and usually had no memory of the procedure afterward. But here's the terrifying part. The line between an effective dose and a fatal dose was razor thin. Surgeons estimated dosages based on the patient's size and constitution, but it was far from an exact science. Some patients never woke up. Others woke up mid-surgery, which is the stuff of nightmares. The successful surgeon was one who had a good, intuitive sense of dosing, and probably a little bit of luck. There's an account from medieval Italy of a surgeon named Guglielmo da Salicito, who successfully removed a bladder stone from a patient using dwale anesthesia. The patient, a merchant named Francesco, drank the potion and fell into a deep sleep within minutes. The surgery took about 40 minutes, during which Francesco remained motionless and apparently unaware of the surgeon cutting into his abdomen. He woke several hours later, groggy and confused, but alive. He also had zero memory of the surgery itself, which was almost certainly a blessing. Medieval battlefields were another place where mind-altering substances played a crucial role. Knights and soldiers often drank wine or ale before battle to dull fear and pain. But some warriors took it further. There are accounts of berserkers, Norse warriors who fought with almost superhuman fury who may have consumed substances like henbane or fly agaric mushrooms before battle to induce their characteristic rage and farlessness. Speaking of mushrooms, let's take a little detour into mycology, because medieval people definitely knew about magic mushrooms, even if they didn't call them that. Psilocybin mushrooms grow naturally throughout Europe, and there's evidence that people knew about their effects. They were called various names, like fairy mushrooms or fool's mushrooms, and folklore warned against eating them because they would make you see fairies and spirits. But here's the thing about folklore warnings. They're often based on people actually doing the thing and finding out what happens. Some people absolutely ate these mushrooms, either accidentally or deliberately. In medieval Ireland and Scotland, there are folk stories about people eating certain mushrooms and then claiming to have been taken to the fairy realm, where they danced with the fae folk for what seemed like hours, but turned out to be days in the mortal world. One story from medieval Ireland tells of a farmer named Oisin who ate mushrooms growing near a fairy ring and then claimed to have traveled to Trnang, the land of eternal youth. He said he spent 3 weeks there, feasting and dancing, only to return and find that 300 years had passed. Now, either Oisin had the wildest mushroom trip in history, or he just wandered off into the woods for a few days while completely zonked and lost track of time. Either way, this story was told and retold throughout the medieval period. The medical theory behind all this drug use was based on the concept of the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow, bile, and black bile. Medieval physicians believed that illness resulted from an imbalance of these humors. and their treatments aim to restore balance. Many of the psychoactive substances we've discussed were classified according to their humoral properties. Opium, for instance, was considered cold and dry, making it useful for treating conditions caused by excess heat and moisture. Mandrake was cold and moist, good for counteracting hot and dry conditions. The fact that these substances also got you higher than a cathedral ceiling was considered a side effect, or, in some cases, part of the therapeutic process. Medieval physicians also believed in the doctrine of signatures, the idea that God had marked plants with signs indicating their uses. Mandrake's humanoid shape meant it was good for treating human ailments. Walnuts looked like little brains, so they must be good for head problems. Bloodroot had red sap, so obviously it was good for blood disorders. This system made zero scientific sense, but it did lead physicians to experiment with various plants and discover their consummate, and discover their guile and error, and lots of errors. Like a lot of errors. There was also the concept of sympathetic magic, where substances were believed to work through magical correspondence rather than physical properties. A love potion might contain rose petals because roses are associated with love, plus some mandrake root to induce those loving feelings. Plus maybe some wine because everything's better with wine. Did it work? Well, the mandrake would certainly make you feel something. And that something might be interpreted as love if you were already inclined that way. Women in medieval society had a particularly complex relationship with mind-altering substances. Midwives used various herbs to ease childbirth, including ergot to induce labor, opium for pain relief, and various herbs to stop bleeding. They also prepared remedies for women's complaints ranging from menstrual cramps to menopause symptoms. But this knowledge made women dangerous in the eyes of the church and secular authorities. A woman who could ease pain, prevent pregnancy, or induce abortion through her knowledge of herbs was wielding a form of power that threatened patriarchal control. The witch trials of the late medieval and early modern periods often targeted women with knowledge of herbs and healing. The story of Jacoba Felici is instructive here. In 1322, this woman was brought to trial in Paris for practicing medicine without a license. The charges against her included administering herbs and potions to patients. Her defense was simple. She was good at healing people, and they got better under her care. Multiple witnesses testified that she had cured them when licensed male physicians had failed. The court found her guilty anyway and banned her from practicing medicine. Why? Because she was a woman with knowledge, and that was too threatening to the establishment. Let's talk about love potions, because medieval people were absolutely obsessed with them. These concoctions were meant to make someone fall in love with you, and they often contain psychoactive ingredients mixed with various symbolic items. A typical love potion recipe might include wine as a base, ground mandrake root for its alleged aphrodisiac properties, rose petals for love, honey for sweetness, and sometimes a few drops of the preparer's own blood or other bodily fluids for personal connection. Did they work? Well, the mandrake would certainly affect the drinker's mental state, and they might become more suggestible or disinhibited. Whether that translated to actual love or just weird behavior is another question. There are court records of people being accused of using love potions on unwilling victims, which was considered a form of assault. One case from 14th century France involved a woman named Marie, who allegedly gave a love potion to a man who then became obsessed with her. When the effects wore off and he realized what had happened, he sued her. The court took the case seriously, which tells you that medieval people believed these potions genuinely worked. The marketplace was another venue where psychoactive substances changed hands. Street vendors sold all sorts of remedies, some legitimate and some pure snake oil. There was no FDA, no drug testing, no labeling requirements. If someone claimed their potion would cure your headache, help you sleep, or give you prophetic dreams, you either trusted them or you didn't. This led to some wild scenarios. In London, there are records of a vendor who sold dream-inducing waters at market. People who drank them reported vivid, bizarre dreams. Modern analysis suggests the water probably contains small amounts of henbane or a similar substance. The vendor made good money until someone drank too much, had a psychotic episode, and jumped into the Thames River convinced they could breathe underwater. After that incident, the city authorities cracked down on unlicensed remedy sellers. At least temporarily, pilgrimage was another aspect of medieval life where substances played a role. Pilgrims traveling to holy sites like Santiago de Compostela or Canterbury would carry various remedies with them for the journey. These often included tinctures containing opium for pain, mandrake for sleep, and other herbs for various ailments. The journey itself was grueling, and many pilgrims relied on these substances to make it tolerable. Some pilgrimage sites became associated with particular healing properties. The Shrine of Saint Anthony in France, for instance, was known for healing ergotism saint, Canis fire. Pilgrims suffering from ergot poisoning would travel there, seeking a cure. The irony is that simply getting away from their contaminated grain supply and eating different food during the journey probably did more to cure them than any supernatural intervention. But the shrine still got the credit. Universities in medieval Europe were centers of medical learning, and scholars there studied the properties of various substances. The medical faculty at the University of Salerno in Italy was particularly famous. They translated Arabic medical texts that contained detailed information about drugs and their effects. These texts described opium, cannabis, henbane, and numerous other substances, including their proper dosages and uses. But academic knowledge and street practice were often very different things. A university-trained physician might know the theoretical properties of mandrake based on ancient texts. But the village-wise woman who actually grew and prepared it probably had more practical experience with dosing and effects. This created tension between formal and informal medical practitioners. Let's talk about medieval parties, because yes, people partied in the Middle Ages, and yes, substances were involved. Wealthy nobles held elaborate feasts where wine flowed freely, often spiced with various herbs and substances. Hippocras was a popular spiced wine that could include cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and sometimes mind-altering additions like opium or henbane in small amounts. At one feast hosted by the SHO of Burgundy in 1454, the wine was so heavily spiced that multiple guests reported feeling most strangely affected and experiencing visions of paradise. Whether this was due to alcohol alone or to additional ingredients is unclear. But given the elaborate nature of noble feasting and the tendency to show off wealth through exotic ingredients, it's entirely possible the wine contained more than just grapes and spices. Jesters and entertainers at these feasts sometimes consume substances to enhance their performances. There are accounts of jesters drinking strange concoctions before performing seemingly impossible feats or speaking with unusual eloquence and wit. Some historians suggest these performers may have been using mild stimulants or hallucinogens to alter their mental state and enhance creativity. Religious festivals and holidays were other occasions when substance use might increase. During Carnival, the period before Lent, normal rules were temporarily suspended. People wore masks, reversed social hierarchies, and engaged in behavior that would normally be forbidden. Some of this involved drinking heavily, but there are also suggestions that other substances were used. During these liminal times when the normal order was turned upside down, the connection between substance use and religious experience is particularly fascinating. Medieval Christians practiced various forms of asceticism, including fasting, self-flagellation, and sleep deprivation, all of which can induce altered states of consciousness. When combined with accidental or deliberate consumption of psychoactive substances, these practices could produce profound mystical experiences. Saint Catherine of Siena, a 14th-century mystic, experienced elaborate visions, and claimed to receive stigmata wounds matching those of Christ. She also practiced extreme fasting, sometimes eating nothing but communion wafers for days at a time. Modern scholars debate whether her experiences were purely spiritual, or whether prolonged fasting combined with possible ergot contamination of the communion. Bread contributed to her visions. Mystics like Catherine walked a fine line. Their visions could be interpreted as divine inspiration or as demonic possession, depending on who was evaluating them. The Church was both fascinated and terrified by people who claimed direct experience of the divine, especially if those people were women, who couldn't be easily controlled through traditional church hierarchy. Before we go further, I want to take a moment to say, if you're still with me on this journey through medieval adulteration, you're exactly the kind of viewer I want in the Dreamless Timelines community. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, because we've got so much more fascinating, bizarre, and educational history content coming your way. And comment below with what surprised you most. So far I actually read every comment and love hearing from you all. Now, let's talk about some specific historical incidents where substances played a major role in shaping events. The Siege of Jerusalem during the First Crusade in 1099 is a horrifying example. Crusaders had been marching for years, suffering from hunger, disease, and exhaustion. When they finally reached Jerusalem, some accounts describe them experiencing mass hallucinations of saints and angels appearing in the sky, urging them forward. Were these divine visions? Or were they the result of ergot-contaminated bread, dehydration, heat exhaustion, and the psychotic break that can come from prolonged stress and violence? Probably a mix of everything. But the substances in their diet certainly didn't help maintain a grip on reality. After the Crusaders broke through the walls, they slaughtered nearly everyone in the city in an orgy of violence that shocked even medieval observers. Some historians suggest that the combination of religious fervor, group hysteria, and possible substance effects created a perfect storm of medieval horror. The Children's Crusade of 1212 is another weird one. Thousands of children and young people supposedly gathered to march to the Holy Land, believing their innocence would succeed where armed knights had failed. Most historians now believe this was actually a movement of poor people, not specifically children, but the details are murky. What's interesting is that many participants reported having visions or prophetic dreams telling them to go on this crusade. Were these genuine religious experiences, or was there ergot contamination in the grain supply that year? We'll never know for certain. But the timing and symptoms are suspicious. The dancing plagues that occurred periodically throughout medieval Europe are perhaps the most spectacular examples of mass substance effects. The most famous was in Strasbourg in 1518, but there were others. In 1374, a dancing plague affected the regions along the Rhine River. People danced uncontrollably for days, many of them until they collapsed from exhaustion. Modern theories about these dancing plagues include mass psychogenic illness, but ergot poisoning is a leading candidate. The symptoms of ergotism include convulsions and involuntary movements that could be interpreted as dancing. Add in the medieval tendency to see illness as divine punishment requiring a physical response, and you get people dancing en masse, believing they're compelled by supernatural forces when they're actually being controlled by a fungus. Individual cases of poisoning, accidental or deliberate, were common in medieval society. Poison was the weapon of choice for those who couldn't challenge their enemies openly. Noble families employed food tasters to protect against poisoning. But these poor souls were essentially human canaries, and their life expectancy was not great. One famous case involved the French royal family in 1393. King Charles VI of France began having episodes of madness where he didn't recognize his family, believed he was made of glass and would shatter if touched, and had violent outbursts. Modern historians debate whether he had a genetic mental illness or whether he was being slowly poisoned with substances like mercury or arsenic, which could produce similar symptoms. Some theories even suggest ergot poisoning. Whatever the cause, his madness destabilized France for decades. Mercury deserves special mention because medieval people used it for everything. Despite its extreme toxicity, alchemists were obsessed with mercury, believing it was a key ingredient in creating the Philosopher's Stone. Physicians used mercury compounds to treat diseases, especially syphilis, once that showed up in Europe in the late 1400s. The cure was often worse than the disease, with mercury poisoning causing tremors, personality changes, and hallucinations. The phrase "mad as a hatter" comes from this era. Hat makers used mercury in the felting process and often suffered mercury poisoning, leading to the stereotype of hatters being mentally unstable. But in medieval times, mercury madness could affect anyone who was treated with mercury-based medicines, which was a lot of people. Alchemy was the intersection of science, mysticism, and pharmacy in medieval times. Alchemists experimented with all sorts of substances, including psychoactive ones. They were trying to transmute base metals into gold, discover the elixir of life, and unlock the secrets of the universe. What they actually discovered was a lot of interesting chemistry and the effects of various toxins on the human body. Because alchemists frequently tested their concoctions on scent, one alchemist in 14th century Prague claimed to have discovered a formula that granted temporary clairvoyance. His recipe included opium, mandrake, mercury, and several other toxic ingredients. He apparently took this potion before important experiments, believing it helped him perceive hidden truths. He died at age 37, probably from chronic poisoning, but not before writing extensive notes on his visions and experiences that sound very much like someone on a sustained toxic trip. The connection between alchemy and medicine was strong. Many physicians were also alchemists, and they applied alchemical principles to medicine. They created tinctures and elixirs that were basically alcohol extracts of various plants, including psychoactive ones. Some of these preparations were genuinely useful, like tincture of opium for pain relief. Others were elaborate placebos with added ingredients to make them seem more potent. Speaking of placebos, medieval medicine relied heavily on the power of belief. A remedy was more likely to work if it was expensive, exotic, and prepared with elaborate ritual. This is why physicians included rare ingredients from distant lands in their formulas, even if those ingredients didn't do much pharmacologically. The psychological effect was real, and when combined with actually psychoactive substances, it created powerful medicine, or, at least, medicine that people believed was powerful. There's a fascinating case from medieval England where a physician treated a noble lady's chronic pain with a preparation he claimed contained ground unicorn horn, pearls dissolved in vinegar, gold leaf, and opium. The first three ingredients were either fake or useless, but the opium definitely worked. The lady swore by this medicine and paid enormous sums for it. Was she being scammed? Partially. But she was also getting effective pain relief, so maybe it was worth it from her perspective. The Silk Road and other trade routes brought substances from Asia and the Middle East into Europe. Cannabis came from Central Asia, though it was more valued for hemp fiber than for getting high. Opium came from the Mediterranean and Middle East. Various spices with mild psychoactive properties came from India and Southeast Asia. These trade goods were expensive and primarily available to the wealthy. Marco Polo's travels in the 13th century included accounts of hashish use in Persia and surrounding regions. When he returned to Venice, he brought stories of the old man of the mountain who allegedly drugged his followers with hashish and showed them a false paradise, then sent them out as assassins. Whether this story is accurate is debatable. The word assassin supposedly comes from hashashin or hashichers, though modern scholars dispute this etymology. But the story captured medieval European imagination and contributed to both fascination with and fear of Eastern drugs. Trade also brought substances the other way. European merchants sold local products, including preparations containing European psychoactive plants, to markets in the Middle East and beyond. Medical knowledge and recipes traveled along with the physical substances, spreading techniques and preparations across cultures. The Black Death, which killed roughly a third of Europe's population in the 14th century, had complex interactions with substance use. Physicians desperately tried various remedies to treat plague victims or protect themselves. These included preparations with opium, various herbs, and some truly bizarre ingredients like ground emeralds or powdered rubies for the wealthy who could afford such. Nonsense. Some people turned to substances as a way of coping with the horror and fear. Drinking heavily was common, but there are also accounts of people seeking out stronger substances. In plague-stricken cities, normal social order broke down, and people did things they wouldn't normally do. Some sought oblivion through whatever substances they could find, preferring to die intoxicated and happy rather than sober and terrified. There are also theories that the Black Death itself may have interacted with ergot contamination. Plague weakened immune systems and stressed food supplies. Desperate people ate grain that they might normally have rejected as contaminated. The combination of plague, starvation, ergotism, and mass hysteria created a perfect storm of medieval apocalyptic horror. The aftermath of the Black Death changed European society fundamentally. With so many dead survivors had more bargaining power, wages rose, and social mobility increased. Some historians argue that the breakdown of old certainties during the plague years contributed to the questioning of authority that eventually led to the Renaissance and Reformation. And substances played a role throughout this transformation. From the desperate remedies sought during the plague to the consciousness-altering experiences that helped people reimagine their world, Jewish and Islamic. Medicine in medieval times often had more sophisticated understandings of drugs and dosing than Christian European medicine. Jewish physicians like Maimonides wrote detailed treatises on various substances, including opium, cannabis, and many herbs. These texts were translated into Latin and influenced European medical practice. Though Christian physicians often didn't credit their Jewish and Islamic sources, Islamic medicine, building on Greek texts that had been lost in Europe, preserved an expanded knowledge of pharmacology. The works of physicians like Avicenna described hundreds of drugs and their properties. When these texts reached Europe through Spain and Sicily, they revolutionized European medicine. Suddenly, Christian physicians had access to systematic knowledge about dosing, drug interactions, and proper preparation of medicines. However, there was religious tension around this knowledge. Using medical wisdom from Jewish or Islamic sources could make one suspect of heresy. Some physicians were accused of being secret Jews or Muslims, based solely on their medical practices and the substances they used. The Church's distrust of foreign knowledge sometimes hindered the spread of genuinely useful medical information. Confession and penance also intersected with substance use in interesting ways. If someone used a love potion or consulted a wise woman for a remedy, they might later confess this to a priest as a sin. Confessors' manuals from the medieval period include sections on how to deal with penitents who admitted to using magical preparations or herbs. The Church's position was complicated. Using herbs for legitimate medicine was acceptable. Using them for magic or to manipulate free will was sinful. But the line between the two was blurry. A potion to ease pain was medicine. A potion to make someone fall in love with you was sorcery. A potion that induced visions could be either divine inspiration or demonic possession, depending on context and interpretation. Some monks and priests themselves used substances. There are accounts of priests adding psychoactive ingredients to sacramental wine for their own use, though this was definitely against the rules. Monastic breweries produced strong beers and ales, and sometimes these included additional herbal ingredients. Whether these additions were for flavor, preservation, or effect is debated. Let's talk about medieval dreams, because people took dreams very seriously, and substances that influenced dreams were highly valued. Medieval people believed dreams could be prophetic, that God or demons could communicate through dreams, and that the dream world was as real as the waking world. Substances like Mandrake, Henbane, and opium all influenced dreams, making them more vivid, bizarre, or memorable. People who took these substances before sleep often reported extraordinary dreams that they interpreted as meaningful messages. Dream interpretation manuals from the medieval period provided guidance on what various dream symbols meant. There are accounts of people deliberately taking substances to induce prophetic dreams, especially before making important decisions. A merchant might take a preparation before sleep to dream about whether a business deal would be successful. A knight might seek prophetic dreams before a battle. Whether the dreams actually predicted the future or just reflected the dreamer's subconscious hopes and fears mixed with drug effects is a question for the philosophers. But medieval people often believed in and acted on these dreams. Nightmares were taken seriously too. Repeated nightmares could be a sign of demonic attack or witchcraft. People sought remedies to prevent nightmares, which ironically sometimes included substances that actually caused vivid dreams, but in a more positive way. It's like fighting fire with fire, except the fire is psychoactive drugs and your brain is the kindling. Gender played a huge role in who was allowed to use and prescribe substances. Male physicians, especially university-trained ones, had official sanction. Female healers operated in a gray area, tolerated when convenient, persecuted when threatening. And their knowledge often exceeded that of formal physicians because it was based on practical experience rather than ancient texts. There's a story from 15th century Germany about a dispute between a university-trained physician and a local wise woman. A nobleman's wife was suffering from severe headaches. The physician prescribed bloodletting and a complex preparation involving powdered gems and gold. This cost a fortune and didn't help. The wise woman suggested a simple tea made from feverfew and willow bark, with a small amount of poppy for severe pain. The remedy worked. The physician accused the woman of witchcraft. She was investigated but ultimately cleared, largely because the nobleman whose wife she'd healed spoke in her defense. But the story illustrates the gendered politics of medicine and how women's empirical knowledge was often dismissed or criminalized. Accusations of witchcraft often centered on substance use. If a woman had a collection of herbs, especially ones like Mandrake or Henbane, this could be presented as evidence of witchcraft. If she prepared remedies that worked too well, she might be accused of using demonic power. If her remedies failed, she might be accused of deliberate harm. Women couldn't win. The witch trial transcripts from the late medieval and early modern periods are full of confessions extracted under torture about using various substances. Women confessed to making flying ointments, love potions, poisons, and all sorts of magical preparations. How many of these confessions were true? How many were extracted through torture? And how many reflected actual medicinal practice interpreted through a lens of demonic panic is impossible to determine. But it's clear that knowledge of psychoactive plants and their effects was central to many witchcraft accusations. Let me tell you about a wild case from 1440s France. A woman named Guillemette was accused of being a witch because several people in her village claimed she had given them drinks that made them see demons. Under investigation, it turned out Guillemette had been making a tea using henbane and datura to help people with chronic pain and insomnia. The people who saw demons had been given too strong a dose and hallucinated. Guillemette was tortured until she confessed to consorting with demons, then executed. Her actual crime was being bad at dosing mind-altering drugs, but she died as a witch. The economic aspects of the medieval drug trade are fascinating too. Certain substances were incredibly valuable. Opium, when available, was expensive. Mandrake root could fetch high prices, especially if it was a particularly humanoid-shaped one. Spices like nutmeg and cloves were worth their weight in silver. This made the drug trade lucrative for merchants, physicians, and even some monasteries that sold remedies. Venice became enormously wealthy, partly through its full control of trade routes, bringing exotic goods, including medicinal substances from the East. The city's apothecaries were famous throughout Europe. To become a licensed apothecary in Venice required years of training and knowledge of hundreds of substances. These professionals were part pharmacist, part chemist, part businessman, and they made serious money. The trade also created opportunities for fraud. Selling fake or adulterated substances was common. Ground would passed off as mandrake root. Colored water sold as exotic tinctures. The penalties for fraud could be severe. Merchants caught selling fake medicines might be fined, imprisoned, or even executed, but the potential profits made it worth the risk for some. Quality control was minimal. There were no standardized measurements, no chemical testing, no way to verify that what you were buying was what the seller claimed. Buyers relied on reputation and trust, which is why established merchants and apothecaries could charge premium prices. You were paying partly for the substance itself and partly for the assurance that it was genuine and properly prepared. Let's talk about some of the weirder substances medieval people experimented with. Toad venom, for instance. Certain toads secrete psychoactive compounds through their skin. Medieval people knew this and created preparations using dried toad venom. These were supposedly useful for various ailments, but they definitely caused altered states of consciousness. Whether anyone was licking toads like some kind of medieval stoner is unclear from the records. But dried toad secretions definitely made it into some medicinal preparations. Spiderwebs were thought to have healing properties and were used in various remedies. Some preparations involving spiders may have included venom, which has neurological effects. Bee venom was also used, and while the therapeutic effects were probably minimal, it certainly had effects on consciousness, mainly convincing you that you'd made a terrible life choice. Animal parts from exotic creatures were prized. Ground horn from various animals, which was often just keratin and did nothing pharmacologically, was nonetheless expensive and sought after. But some animal-derived substances did have real effects. Glands from beavers produced a substance called castoreum, which was used in medicines and perfumes and has mild psychoactive properties. Whether medieval perfume wearers were getting a subtle-ish high is an amusing thought. Amber was considered to have healing properties and was ground into powder for medicinal use, while amber itself is just fossilized tree resin. Some medieval preparations that claimed to contain amber may have included other substances that actually had psychoactive effects. The medieval banquet table was a pharmacological adventure. Aside from the heavily spiced wine, foods were prepared with various herbs and spices, some of which had mind-altering properties. Saffron, for instance, which was and still is extremely expensive, has mild mood-lovating effects if consumed in significant quantities. Poppy seeds were used in baking and cooking, and while the amounts were usually too small to have much effect, there are accounts of people becoming drowsy or euphoric after eating particularly poppy seed-heavy dishes. Honey mead was popular, and some varieties included herbs steeped in the honey before fermentation. These metheglin or herb-infused meads could contain a variety of psychoactive plants. A strong metheglin after a feast might have you seeing double. And not just from the alcohol content. The royal court of various kingdoms had official positions, like royal food taster and royal physician. But they also sometimes had unofficial specialists in more exotic preparations. These individuals might prepare special wines, foods, or remedies for the monarch using rare and powerful substances. They operated with discretion because their work was valuable but also potentially dangerous, both to consume and politically. There's a story, probably apocryphal but telling nonetheless, about Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen of France and later England in the 12th century. She supposedly maintained a private collection of remedies and preparations, some quite powerful, which she used for various purposes from easing menstrual cramps to staying alert during long political negotiations. Whether this is true or legend, it reflects the reality that powerful people had access to powerful substances and the knowledge to use them. The Crusades brought Europeans into contact with Middle Eastern and Asian drug culture, and this exchange went both ways. Crusaders encountered hashish, opium in forms they hadn't seen before, and various preparations from Arabic medicine. They brought some of this knowledge back to Europe. At the same time, they introduced European substances and practices to the Middle East. The military orders, like the Knights Templar and Hospitallers, ran hospitals and had their own medical traditions. They treated wounded knights and pilgrims with various remedies, including strong pain relievers that definitely included opium and probably other psychoactive substances. The Templars in particular were later accused of all sorts of heretical practices, some of which allegedly involved drugs and strange rituals. Most of these accusations were probably fabricated to justify destroying the order and seizing their wealth. But they reflect medieval anxieties about substances and secret knowledge. Pilgrimage. Routes became conduits for medical knowledge and substances. Pilgrims traveling from northern Europe to Santiago de Compostela in Spain, or from England to Rome, would encounter different medical traditions and local remedies. They'd bring knowledge and sometimes physical samples back home. This created a gradual diffusion of pharmacological knowledge across Europe. The university system that developed in medieval Europe included medical faculties that attempted to systematize drug knowledge. At places like Salerno, Montpellier, Bologna, and Paris, medical students learned about various substances from ancient texts and contemporary practice. But the gap between theory and practice remained huge. A physician might memorize Galen's theories about humoral balance and drug properties, but applying that knowledge to actual patients was another matter entirely. Anatomical knowledge was limited because the church restricted dissection of human bodies. This meant that medical understanding of how drugs actually worked in the body was pretty much pure speculation. Physicians didn't understand circulation, nervous systems, or brain chemistry. They worked with theories that were centuries old and often wrong. But through trial and error, they did figure out which substances worked for which conditions, even if they had no idea why. The development of distillation technology in medieval times was huge for pharmacology. Arab alchemists had perfected distillation, and this knowledge reached Europe in the 12th and 13th centuries. Suddenly, physicians could create much more concentrated alcohol extracts of psychoactive plants. They called distilled alcohol aqua vita, the water of life, and believed it had almost magical properties. With distillation, doses of psychoactive substances could be much more precisely controlled. A tincture made with distilled alcohol could contain a known concentration of the active plant compounds. This made medicine somewhat safer and more predictable, though somewhat is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Distilled spirits themselves became popular and were initially sold as medicine. Strong alcohol was believed to preserve health and extend life. Whether the medieval people who drank aqua vita regularly were self-medicating, getting drunk, or genuinely pursuing health, is probably a little bit of all three. The role of astrology in medieval medicine is another wild aspect. Physicians believed that the stars and planets influenced both health and the effectiveness of medicines. Substances had to be prepared during auspicious astrological times to be most effective. Opium harvested when Mars was ascendant might be more powerful than opium harvested at other times. Or so they believed. This added a layer of ritual and magic to medicine that probably didn't change the pharmacological properties of anything. But it did affect people's belief in the effectiveness of remedies. The placebo effect is real, and if a patient believed their medicine was more powerful because it had been prepared during the right astrological conjunction, they might experience greater benefit. Physicians would consult astrological charts before treating patients, looking for optimal times to administer medicines or perform procedures. They also believed that a patient's astrological sign influenced what substances would work best for them. An Aries patient might need different medicines than a Pisces patient, because their humoral balances were supposedly different based on their birth charts. The connection between medieval substance use and art is worth exploring. Some historians suggest that the bizarre imagery in medieval art demons, fantastic beasts, surreal landscapes may reflect artists' experiences with psychoactive substances. Whether painters, sculptors, and illuminators of manuscripts were deliberately using substances to enhance creativity or were just reflecting the generally trippy nature of medieval consciousness is debatable. The marginalia in illuminated manuscripts sometimes depicts absolutely bonkers stuff. Rabbits hunting humans, priests riding snails, bizarre hybrid creatures. Was the monk illuminating this manuscript high? Maybe. Was he just bored and being subversive? Also possible. The medieval sense of humor and symbolism was different from ours. But it's fun to imagine medieval artists getting creative assistance from Mandrake or Ergot, the architecture of medieval cathedrals. With their soaring heights, colored light through stained glass, and acoustics designed to make chanting sound otherworldly, was meant to induce altered states of consciousness through sensory experience. Combine that with fasting, lack of sleep, and potentially ergot-contaminated communion bread, and you have a recipe for transcendent religious experiences that don't require any deliberate drug use, but might have involved accidental drug use. Anyway, music too was believed to have healing properties and could be combined with substances for therapeutic effect. Medieval music theory was connected to medicine through the same humoral frameworks. Certain modes were heating, others cooling. Music could rebalance the humors, especially when combined with appropriate medicines. A melancholy patient might be given stimulating substances and upbeat music to counteract their excessive black bile. Now, let's get into some of the darker aspects of medieval substance use. Because it wasn't all mystical visions and pain relief. Addiction was real, even if medieval people didn't understand it in modern terms. Habitual opium users developed dependence and tolerance. People who regularly used Mandrake or Henbane might find they needed more and more to achieve the same effects. There are scattered references in medieval texts to people who couldn't function without their regular dose of certain substances. These were usually framed as people who had become enslaved to their medicines or who had been enchanted by sorcerous potions. The moral and religious interpretation of addiction was that it represented weakness of will or demonic influence, not a medical condition. Withdrawal wasn't understood as a physiological process. If someone who regularly used opium suddenly stopped, they'd experience withdrawal symptoms, pain, anxiety, nausea, tremors. Medieval observers would have interpreted this as the person's original illness returning, or as evidence that they'd been cursed or poisoned. The solution might be to resume taking the substance. But the cycle of dependence wasn't recognized for what it was. Overdoses happened frequently. The line between an effective dose and a fatal dose was thin for many substances, and there was no way to be precise about dosing. How much active compound was in a given batch of opium or mandrake could vary wildly based on growing conditions, storage, preparation method, and other factors. A dose that worked fine last time might kill you. This time, if the preparation happened to be more concentrated, death by overdose might be recorded as died from an excess of medicine. or the cure proved too strong. Sometimes, it was recorded as suspicious, especially if there were inheritance issues or feuds involved. Determining whether an overdose was accidental, suicidal, or murderous was nearly impossible with medieval investigative techniques. Suicide using substances was definitely a thing. Medieval Christian doctrine held that suicide was a mortal sin that would send you straight to hell. But desperate people still did it. Access to lethal doses of substances like hemlock, henbane, or opium provided a means. These deaths were often covered up by families to avoid the stigma and ensure the person could receive Christian burial. So the actual rate of suicide by poisoning is unknown, but was probably higher than records suggest. Infanticide and abortion using herbs were practiced despite being illegal and condemned by the church. Various plants, including pennyroyal, tansy, and rue, were known to induce miscarriage. The use of these abortifacients was a closely guarded secret among women, passed down through female networks. Women caught using or providing these substances could be severely punished. But the practice continued throughout the medieval period, because women had limited control over their reproductive lives and sometimes felt desperate. Murder by poison was a constant fear among the powerful. Kings, queens, nobles, and wealthy merchants worried about being poisoned by rivals. This fear was well-founded. Poisoning was an effective way to eliminate enemies while maintaining plausible deniability. The symptoms of many poisons could be mistaken for natural illness, especially in an era when sudden illness and death were common. Some poisons acted slowly, making the cause of death even harder to determine. Arsenic, which was available as a rat poison, could be administered in small doses over time, causing symptoms that looked like wasting illness. The victim would gradually weaken and die. And unless someone specifically suspected poisoning, it would be attributed to natural causes. The political instability of medieval Europe meant that poisoning was a tool of statecraft. Inconvenient heirs, troublesome bishops, and rival claimants to thrones sometimes died under suspicious circumstances that might have involved poison, proving it was almost impossible. An accusation of poisoning was a useful political weapon even when there was no actual poison involved. Okay, quick break to remind you. If you're finding this deep dive into medieval pharmaceuticals as fascinating as I am, show some love to Dreamless Timelines by dropping a like on this video and leaving a comment about what aspect of medieval substance use has blown your mind the most. And seriously, subscribe if you haven't yet. We're just getting started with the bizarre and educational history content, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. The medieval legal system had to deal with substance-related crimes, and the laws were inconsistent and often bizarre by modern standards. Selling fake medicines might be punished severely, but selling real poison might go unpunished if the seller could claim ignorance of the buyer's intent. Using substances to enchant someone was illegal, but defining what counted as enchantment versus medicine was subjective. Women who provided love potions or abortifacients operated in a dangerous legal gray area. If the potion worked and the client was happy, it might remain secret. If something went wrong, if the love potion made someone sick, or the abortifacient killed the woman, the provider could be prosecuted for sorcery or murder. Theft of medicines and substances was a problem. Opium, mandrake root, and other valuable substances were targets for thieves. Apothecaries had to secure their stock like jewelers protecting gems. There are records of break-ins at apothecary shops where the thieves ignored money and goods. To steal specific medicinal substances, the church's role in regulating substance use was contradictory. On one hand, the church ran hospitals and infirmaries where medicines, including opium, were used. Monasteries cultivated medicinal herbs. The church preserved medical texts. On the other hand, the church condemned as sorcery many practices involving the same substances, especially when done by lay people outside church control. The line between acceptable medicine and condemned. Sorcery often came down to who was doing it and what explanation they gave. A monk administering opium to a sick patient was performing an act of charity. A village woman giving opium to someone in pain might be accused of practicing folk magic. The substance was the same. The context determined whether it was holy or heretical. Confession created an interesting situation. If someone confessed to using questionable substances or practices, the priest was bound by the seal of confession not to reveal this. But the priest also had to assign appropriate penance and ensure the person didn't continue in sin. Some confessors' manuals suggest that priests struggled with how to handle confessions related to substances, especially when the substance use seemed motivated by desperation or legitimate need rather than malice. Medieval people's understanding of consciousness was fundamentally different from ours. They didn't have concepts like brain chemistry or neurotransmitters. When substances changed their mental state, they interpreted this through their existing frameworks: humoral imbalance, divine or demonic influence, magic, or natural properties of substances as given by God. This meant that the subjective experience of being high in medieval times was filtered through a completely different interpretive lens. If you ate ergot-contaminated bread and started hallucinating, might interpret your visions as messages from God, attacks by demons, or evidence that you'd been bewitched. The pharmacological experience was the same as it would be today, but the meaning assigned to it was wildly different. The lack of distinction between psychological and spiritual experiences meant that substance-induced altered states were taken very seriously as sources of genuine knowledge or genuine danger. A vision was a vision, whether it came from fasting and prayer or from eating the wrong mushrooms. The content and context determined whether it was interpreted as divine or demonic, not the physical cause. This also meant that medieval people might have been more open to the insights and experiences that came from altered states. Modern skepticism about drug-induced experiences didn't exist in the same way. If a substance allowed you to see things normally hidden, that was real knowledge, not just a drug trip. The veil between worlds was thinner, and substances could help you peek through. The role of memory and storytelling in medieval substance culture is important too. People shared stories about their experiences, and these stories shaped others' expectations and interpretations. If everyone in your village believes that Mandrake causes prophetic dreams, and you take Mandrake and have a vivid dream, you're more likely to interpret it as prophetic. These shared narratives created a kind of collective framework for drug experiences. The medieval equivalent of set and setting, the psychological and physical context that ruby kiss would Libby kiss. Ruby kiss, mololi ruby kiss. Only ruby kiss has the luxurious. Moly set, most kiffs, moth lock. It's same moles. Well, most kiss, moth sility so willy sility. Malili molest, malela, malili sility, maleloi. Malili saleli salad, malela to malef, maleli, by set. We BMIs, that was it, by Malev. By some malad. Shapes drug experiences was heavily influenced by religious belief, folklore, and community expectations. Traveling through medieval Europe meant encountering different substance cultures. What was common medicine in one region might be unknown in another. Italian city-states had access to substances through Mediterranean trade that weren't available in rural Scotland. French physicians had different preferences and practices than German ones. This regional variation meant that travelers might encounter unfamiliar substances or familiar substances used in new ways. A merchant traveling from London to Constantinople would encounter a whole spectrum of medicinal and recreational substance use. From the relatively conservative practices of Northern Europe to the more elaborate drug culture of the Middle East and beyond, the Hanseatic League, which controlled trade across Northern Europe, was involved in the transport of medicinal substances along with other goods. merchants traveling the league's trade routes carried medicines as valuable commodities. Information about substances and their uses traveled with the physical goods, spreading knowledge across the network. Ports like Venice, Genoa, and Barcelona were nexus points where substances from across the Mediterranean and beyond entered Europe. These cities became centers of pharmaceutical knowledge. An apothecary in Venice might have access to substances that wouldn't reach inland Europe for years. If at all, the Mongol Empire's creation of relatively safe trade routes across Asia in the 13th and 14th centuries, the Pax Mongolica, facilitated the exchange of goods and knowledge between Europe and Asia. Substances and medical texts moved along the Silk Road, enriching the pharmacopoeia available to European physicians. When the Black Death traveled these same trade routes in the 1340s, it brought devastation, but also, ironically, increased exchange of medical knowledge as desperate Europeans sought any remedy from any source that might help. The gradual decline of the medieval period and the transition to the Renaissance brought changes in attitudes toward substances and medicine. The rediscovery of ancient Greek and Roman texts through Arabic translations, combined with new empirical approaches, began to create a more systematic understanding of drugs and their effects. But this was gradual. For most people in the 15th and 16th centuries, medicine still meant humoral theory, astrology, and remedies that had been used for centuries. The village wise woman was still the main healthcare provider for the majority of people. The preparations she made still contained the same psychoactive plants that had been used throughout the medieval period. The invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century was huge for spreading medical knowledge. Herbals and medical texts that had been laboriously copied by hand could now be printed and widely distributed. This democratized access to pharmaceutical knowledge to some extent. Though literacy was still limited and books were expensive, printed herbals showed illustrations of plants and described their uses, making it easier for people to identify and use medicinal plants. But this also meant that dangerous information spread more widely. Instructions for preparing toxic substances became available to anyone who could read, which had both positive and negative consequences. The Reformation in the 16th century disrupted the Church's control over medicine and healing. Protestant reformers rejected many Catholic practices, including the cult of saints that was associated with healing shrines and pilgrimages. This theological shift had practical implications for how people sought healing and what role substances played in religious life. But again, for most ordinary people, the practices around substances didn't change dramatically just because of theological arguments among elites. They still used the remedies their grandmothers had used, sought help from local healers, and occasionally got magnificently high on medieval drugs while trying to cure their toothache. The early modern witch hunts, which peaked in the 16th and 17th centuries, had medieval roots. The association between women, herbs, and witchcraft that we see in the medieval period intensified into the catastrophic witch trials of the later period. Knowledge of substances, especially psychoactive ones, became increasingly dangerous for women to possess. But let's bring this back to the core question. What was getting high like in medieval times? It was terrifying and transcendent. It was healing and harmful. It was divine and demonic. It was medicine and magic, often simultaneously. It happened in monastery gardens and village hovels, in royal chambers and on battlefields. During surgery and religious ecstasy and Saturday night parties, medieval people didn't have the privilege of choosing to get high for recreational purposes the way some modern people do. When they consumed psychoactive substances, it was usually because they were desperate for pain relief. Desperate for healing, desperate to understand God's will, desperate to survive a brutal surgery or childbirth. But within that desperation was an openness to altered states of consciousness that modern secular society has largely lost. Medieval people believed that reality was more than what you could see and touch in ordinary consciousness. Visions mattered. Dreams contained truth. The boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds was permeable. Substances that altered consciousness weren't just chemicals affecting brain chemistry. They were keys that could unlock different levels of reality, portals that could grant access to knowledge normally hidden, tools that could allow communion with the divine or protection against the demonic. This meant that getting high in medieval times was never just a physical experience. It was always also a spiritual, psychological, and social experience, embedded in complex networks of meaning. The monk stumbling through his monastery after accidentally dosing on ergot wasn't just high, he was having a religious experience that might change his understanding of his faith. The peasant woman drinking Mandrake tea for her pain wasn't just seeking relief, she was participating in an ancient tradition of women's healing knowledge that connected her to generations before and after. The knight drinking henbane-laced wine before battle wasn't just dulling his fear, he was preparing to meet his god or his death with courage. Aided by substances that had been used by warriors since ancient times, the fact that these experiences were mediated by actual chemical compounds, affecting actual neurological processes, doesn't make the experiences less real or meaningful. If anything, it makes them more fascinating. The interaction between biochemistry and belief, between molecules and meaning, created the texture of medieval consciousness, and that consciousness was weird by modern standards. Medieval people lived in a world that was simultaneously more brutal and more magical than ours. Pain was constant and relief was precious. Death was ever-present and meaning was essential. Substances that could ease pain, enable healing, or provide glimpses of transcendence were valuable beyond measure. The risks were enormous. Take the wrong dose and you're dead. Take too much regularly and you're addicted, though they didn't have that language. Use your knowledge of herbs too openly as a woman and you might be accused of witchcraft. But the alternatives: untreated pain, unmedicated surgery, childbirth with no relief, were often worse. So medieval people rolled the dice with substances that could heal or harm, enlighten or drive mad, elevate to heaven or consign to hell, sometimes all at once. They did so without controlled clinical trials, without pharmaceutical regulations, without even a basic understanding of how these substances actually worked in the body. They had tradition, experimentation, folklore, prayer, and hope. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. But the attempt to ease suffering and seek meaning through substances that altered consciousness is deeply, recognizably human across all eras. The medieval period shows us a different way of relating to psychoactive substances, not the sterile medical approach of modern pharmaceuticals, not the recreational culture of modern drug use, but something else. A worldview where the medicinal, spiritual, and social dimensions of substance use were inseparable. Is there anything we can learn from medieval substance culture? Maybe. The medieval holistic approach that didn't separate body from mind, from spirit, is something modern medicine is slowly rediscovering. The understanding that set and setting matter. That belief and expectation shape the effects of substances. That healing is more than just biochemistry. These are insights we're relearning. Of course, we don't want to romanticize medieval medicine. It was dangerous, often ineffective, and based on faulty theories. People died from contaminated medicines, wrong doses, and plain bad luck. The lack of scientific understanding meant that progress was slow and setbacks were common, but within the limits of their knowledge. Medieval people developed sophisticated practices around psychoactive substances. They understood that different plants had different effects. They developed preparation methods that extracted and concentrated active compounds. They recognized the importance of dosing, even if they couldn't measure precisely. They passed down knowledge through generations, preserving what worked and slowly discarding what didn't. The wise women and monks, the physicians and apothecaries, the desperate and the curious Saul contributed to a body of practical knowledge about substances that functioned as medieval society's pharmacological infrastructure. It was messy, unscientific, and dangerous, but it was also the best they could do. And sometimes it was genuinely helpful. The people getting high in medieval times were our ancestors, facing many of the same human problems we face: pain, fear, illness, curiosity, the search for meaning. They used the tools available to them, which happened to include a surprising array of powerful psychoactive substances growing in their gardens, fields, and forests. So the next time you take an aspirin for a headache or see a documentary about medieval life, remember that you're connected to those people not just through genetics, but through the shared human experience of seeking relief and meaning through substances that alter consciousness. The substances have changed. The understanding has improved. But the fundamental human motivations remain recognizably the same. Medieval people getting high were doing something profoundly human, attempting to transcend the limits of ordinary experience, to ease suffering, to glimpse something beyond the everyday. They did it with Mandrake and Henbane instead of modern pharmaceuticals, with prayers instead of clinical trials, with faith instead of science. But the impulse was the same impulse that drives modern medicine, modern spirituality, and yes, modern recreational drug use. And honestly, the fact that a 13th century monk and a modern person taking medication for anxiety are both, in some fundamental way, trying to solve the same human problems, that's beautiful and strange and worth remembering. So here's to Brother Aldrich, giggling in his monastery garden, clutching his ergotine-fected rye. Here's to Marguerite, grinding mandrake for her husband's toothache. Here's to the countless unnamed people throughout the medieval period who grew, prepared, sold, prescribed, took, or suffered the effects of psychoactive substances. They were doing their best with what they had, seeking the same things humans have always sought: relief from suffering, understanding of mysteries, and maybe, just occasionally, a really interesting evening that they'd remember for the rest of their lives, assuming they survived it. The history of getting high in medieval times is really the history of being human in medieval times, with all the terror, wonder, desperation, faith, ingenuity, and occasional accidental hilarity that entails. It's a history written in monastery gardens and village kitchens, in royal courts and peasant fields, in pain relieved and pain inflicted, in visions divine and demonic, in healing and harm. And that, my friends, is what getting high was like in medieval times: complex, dangerous, meaningful, and utterly, fascinatingly human. Before we wrap this up, one final reminder: if this deep dive into medieval pharmacological adventures has been your jam, make sure you're subscribed to Dreamless Timelines. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we drop another deep dive history video. Leave a comment telling me what surprised you most. Was it the flying ointments, the ergot plagues, the fact that medieval people were just out here winging it with toxic plants and prayer? And smash that like button to let me know you want more content like this. Thanks for sticking with me through this, literally through medieval history. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and maybe appreciate modern pharmaceutical regulations just a tiny bit more. Peace out. Now, let's get into some specific substances and cases that really showcase just how wild medieval pharmacology could get. Because trust me, we've only scratched the surface of this rabbit hole, and it goes deep. Let's talk about Belladonna, beautiful lady in Italian, which is one of the most fascinating and dangerous plants in the medieval arsenal. The name comes from the practice of Italian women using diluted belladonna drops in their eyes to dilate their pupils, which was considered attractive. Bigger pupils, bigger eyes, more beautiful lore, so the thinking went. What they were actually doing was poisoning themselves with atropine, one of the most potent tropane alkaloids out there. But belladonna wasn't just for beauty. It was medicine, poison, and ticket to the spirit world all rolled into one nasty little plant. Medieval physicians used it for everything from asthma to excessive sweating. In small doses, it could relax muscles and reduce spasms. In larger doses, it caused rapid heartbeat, hallucinations, violent behavior, and death. There's a case from 1456 in Bavaria where a group of soldiers accidentally ate berries from a belladonna plant while on campaign. Within hours, they were completely out of their minds. Some became violent and attacked their comrades. Others stripped naked and ran into the forest, convinced they were being chased by demons. A few just sat staring at nothing, completely catatonic. 3 of them died. The rest recovered over several days, but had no memory of what they'd done during their belladonna-induced madness. This incident was recorded because it affected military operations. But imagine how many similar poisonings happened to regular people who just didn't know what they were eating. Medieval Europe was full of toxic plants that looked similar to edible ones. The difference between dinner and a nightmare trip could be as simple as picking the wrong berries. Wolfsbane, or aconite, is another plant that deserves special mention. This stuff is seriously toxic. Just touching it can cause numbness and tingling. Eating it causes a sensation of burning in the mouth and throat, followed by numbness, nausea, vomiting, and if you've eaten enough, paralysis and cardiac arrest. Not a fun way to go. Medieval people knew wolfsbane was dangerous, hence the name. As it was used to poison wolf's butt, they also used it medicinally in extremely diluted forms. As a liniment rubbed on the skin, it could provide pain relief for arthritis and muscle aches. The numbing effect made it useful for toothaches too. But the line between therapeutic dose and fatal dose was practically invisible. There are accounts of medieval murderers using wolfsbane to eliminate their enemies. One particularly cold-blooded case from 14th century England involved a woman named Isabella who allegedly poisoned her husband's wine with wolfsbane. He died in agony, and she inherited his property. She was caught because she got greedy and tried the same trick on her second husband. But he only drank a little of the poisoned wine and survived long enough to accuse her. She was executed, though of course she maintained her innocence. Whether she actually did it or was framed is lost to history. But the case shows that people definitely knew about wolfsbane's deadly properties. Let's talk about a substance that doesn't get enough attention. Deadly nightshade's cousin, black nightshade. This plant is less toxic than belladonna, but still contains enough alkaloids to cause interesting effects. Medieval people used it for inflammation and pain, and in some regions, people actually ate the berries when they were fully ripe. As the toxicity decreases with ripeness. But here's where it gets weird. There are folk traditions from various parts of Europe about black nightshade being used in divination rituals. People would consume small amounts and then try to interpret the visions or dreams that followed as prophetic. Whether these visions actually predicted anything or were just hallucinations is, well, probably the latter. But the practice shows how medieval people saw no clear line between medicine, magic, and spiritual insight. Foxglove is a plant that's absolutely gorgeous tall spikes of purple or white bell-shaped flowers that look like they belong in a fairy garden. It's also incredibly poisonous and contains cardiac glycosides that affect heart rhythm. In the right dose, foxglove can regulate an irregular heartbeat. In the wrong dose, stops your heart entirely. Medieval herbalists figured out that foxglove had effects on the heart, though they didn't understand the mechanism. They used it cautiously for what they called dropsy fluid retention caused by heart failure. The foxglove would make patients urinate more and feel better, at least temporarily. But dosing was a nightmare because the potency of foxglove varies dramatically between plants and even between different parts of the same plant. There's a tragic story from medieval Wales about a healer named Branwen, who was renowned for her skill in treating heart ailments with foxglove. She had an intuitive sense of dosing that came from years of experience. But one day, she prepared a remedy using foxglove plants from a new location, not realizing they were much more potent than the ones she usually used. Her patient, an elderly man with a weak heart, died within hours. Branwen was devastated and gave up healing entirely. The story was passed down as a cautionary tale about the dangers of overconfidence with powerful plants. Now let's get into the really exotic stuff that came from trade routes. Mithridate was a legendary antidote supposedly invented by King Mithridates VI of Pontus, who lived in the 1st century BCE, but whose formula was still famous in medieval times. Mithridate was supposed to protect against all poisons, and recipes for it included dozens of ingredients. Some versions listed over 60 different components. These ingredients included opium, myrrh, saffron, ginger, cinnamon, and all sorts of exotic spices and drugs. The theory was that by consuming tiny amounts of many poisons, you'd build up resistance to all of them. Whether it actually worked is highly doubtful. But wealthy medieval people paid enormous sums for Mithridate preparations. The thing is, with opium and other psychoactive substances in the mix, taking Mithridate definitely did something. You'd feel effects from the opium at minimum. Whether those effects included poison protection is another question. But the placebo effect, combined with actual drug effects, meant people genuinely believed in it. Venice had a monopoly on producing the official Mithridate for much of the medieval period. The city held public demonstrations where condemned criminals would be given poison, then given Mithridate and supposedly survive. Whether these demonstrations were legitimate or staged is unclear, but they were effective marketing. People came from all over Europe to buy Venetian Mithridate. There's a great story about a Venetian apothecary in the 15th century who got caught watering down his Mithridate, choosing cheaper ingredients and less opium than the official recipe called for. When authorities inspected his shop, they found he'd been cutting corners for years, making huge profits by selling inferior product. His punishment was to be paraded through the streets while his fake Mithridate was burned publicly, and then he was banished from Venice. For a Venetian merchant, banishment was basically a death sentence for your business. So the authorities took medicine fraud seriously. Let's talk about some of the mineral-based substances medieval people experimented with, because it wasn't just plants. Mercury we've mentioned, but there was also antimony, which was used as both medicine and poison. Antimony compounds cause vomiting, which medieval physicians saw as a way to purge the body of bad humors. The fact that antimony was also toxic didn't stop them from using it. There were even antimony cups vessels made from antimony that were filled with wine and left overnight. The wine would leach some antimony from the cup, creating a purgative drink. The same cup could be used repeatedly. These antimony cups were passed down as family heirlooms because they were expensive and supposedly highly effective medicines. In reality, they were just a reliable way to give yourself. Antimony poisoning on demand. Lead was another toxic metal that medieval people used extensively. Lead acetate, called sugar of lead because it tasted sweet, was used to sweeten wine and as a medicine. The Romans had done this too, and medieval Europeans continued the practice despite the fact that lead poisoning causes cognitive decline, personality changes, and a host of other problems. There's speculation that some of the erratic behavior of medieval nobles and monarchs might have been partly due to lead poisoning from their fancy lead-sweetened wines and lead-based medicines. King Henry VIII of England, who became increasingly paranoid and erratic in his later years, may have suffered from lead poisoning among other ailments. He certainly had access to all the finest lead-contaminated luxuries that money could. Arsenic is another substance that was widely available in medieval times as a rat poison and preservative. It was also used deliberately as a poison for murder. Arsenic poisoning, symptoms: vomiting, abdominal pain. Diarrhea could be mistaken for cholera or food poisoning, making it an ideal murder weapon if you were patient enough to use small doses over time. The Borgia family in Renaissance Italy. Slightly after the medieval period proper, but using medieval poison techniques, became infamous for allegedly using arsenic to eliminate enemies and inconvenient people. Whether all the stories about the Borgias are true or exaggerated, the fact that people believed them shows that poisoning was a real and constant fear among the powerful. Now, let's talk about some of the stranger animal-derived substances medieval people used. Musk, which comes from glands of the musk deer, was incredibly expensive and highly prized. It was used in perfumes and medicines, and it does have some mild psychoactive properties. Medieval people believed musk was an aphrodisiac and stimulant. And while the effects are subtle, musk does contain compounds that affect mood. Ambergris, which is basically whale vomit or intestinal secretion, lovely, right? Was another expensive substance used in perfumes and medicines. Medieval people who found chunks of ambergris washed up on beaches could become wealthy overnight. It was believed to have all sorts of medicinal properties, though most of these were probably imaginary. But ambergris does smell interesting and has fixative properties in perfume, so it was genuinely valuable for that. Bezoar stones, calcified masses found in the stomachs of ruminant animals like goats, were believed to be universal antidotes to poison. Medieval nobles would pay fortunes for genuine bezoar stones, which they'd either keep on hand for emergencies or have set into drinking vessels. The theory was that if poisoned, you could dip the bezoar in your drink or even swallow it, and it would neutralize the poison. Did bezoars actually work? No, not really. But the belief was strong enough that even into the 17th century, people were testing bezoars by poisoning animals and then trying to cure them with bezoar stones. Spoiler alert, it didn't work, but it took a long time for people to accept this. The medieval obsession with unicorn horn is related to this belief in universal antidotes. Obviously, actual unicorn horns didn't exist, but narwhal tusks were sold as unicorn horns to gullible buyers. These tusks were worth literally their weight in gold. Wealthy people would have cups carved from unicorn horn narwhal tusk, believing that these cups would neutralize any poison put in them. The whole unicorn horn trade was basically a medieval scam, but it was lucrative for anyone lucky enough to get their hands on narwhal tusks. Arctic traders made fortunes selling these tusks to southern merchants, who sold them to nobles and royalty as genuine unicorn horns. The buyers probably suspected they weren't real, but wanted to believe badly enough to pay anyway. Let's get into some specific medical procedures where substances played crucial roles. Trepanation, drilling holes in the skull, was practiced throughout the medieval period to treat head injuries, headaches, and mental illness. The theory was that it released evil spirits or pressure on the brain. Incredibly, some patients survived this. Before trepanation, patients were usually given strong doses of opium and alcohol, sometimes with other substances mixed in. The goal was to get them as close to unconscious as possible without actually killing them. Then the surgeon would drill or scrape through the skull bone while assistants held the patient down. The patient would be screaming and thrashing despite the drugs, because medieval anesthesia wasn't nearly sufficient for this level of trauma. There are skulls from medieval cemeteries that show evidence of trepanation, with subsequent bone healing, proving the person survived at least for a while after the procedure. Whether they were better or worse off afterward is impossible to say, but some people apparently thought it was worth the risk. Cauterization, burning wounds to stop bleeding and prevent infection, was another brutal procedure where substances helped. Patients were given opium, alcohol, and sometimes mandrake before having red-hot irons applied to their wounds. The smell of burning flesh, the smoke, the screaming medieval. Surgery was absolutely horrific, even with the drugs. There's an account from a medieval military surgeon's journal describing a knight who had his arm amputated after a battle injury. The surgeon gave him a strong draught of opium and wine, then had 4 men hold him down while he sawed through the arm and cauterized the stump. The knight survived and apparently recovered well enough to continue fighting in later campaigns, though he was down 1 arm. The surgeon noted that the opium helped significantly, but that the patient was still aware and in terrible pain throughout the procedured. Battlefield medicine in medieval times was where substance use met desperate necessity. Army surgeons carried supplies of opium, alcohol, and various herbs to treat wounded soldiers. They had to work quickly, often in horrible conditions, with limited supplies and hundreds of wounded men needing treatment. Some surgeons developed portable kits containing pre-measured doses of various substances. There are descriptions of these kits, including small bottles of opium tincture, packets of powdered mandrake, strips of cloth soaked in wine, and various herbs that could be applied to wounds and other remedies. A good army surgeon was worth his weight in gold to a medieval commander. The psychological effects of combat and trauma were recognized in medieval times, though not understood in modern terms. Soldiers who had experienced terrible things in battle might be given substances to help them sleep or calm their agitation. Whether this was effective treatment for what we'd now call PTSD is questionable, but it was an attempt to address the mental as well as physical wounds of war. Let's talk about medieval monasteries and nunneries in more detail, because these were major centers of medical knowledge and pharmaceutical production. Monks and nuns cultivated extensive medicinal gardens, copied and preserved medical texts, and treated the sick in infirmaries. The monastery at Monte Cassino in Italy was particularly famous for its medical knowledge. The monks there maintained gardens with hundreds of medicinal plants, including many with psychoactive properties. They produced medicines not just for their own community, but for sale to the surrounding region. The income from selling medicines helped support the monastery. These monastic pharmacists were dealing with the same powerful substances we've been discussing: mandrake, henbane, and so on. But their religious context gave them legitimacy and protection. A monk preparing a sleeping potion with mandrake and opium was doing God's work. A village woman preparing the same thing might be accused of witchcraft. The double standard was, Stark nunneries also produced medicines, and some became renowned for particular specialties. The nuns at the convent of Helfta in Germany were known for their work with women's health issues, preparing remedies for childbirth, menstrual problems, and menopause. These remedies definitely included psychoactive substances for pain relief and to ease anxiety. Saint Hildegard of Bingen ran a convent that was essentially a medieval pharmaceutical company. She wrote extensively about hundreds of plants and their uses, and her works were copied and distributed throughout Europe. Reading her descriptions, it's clear she had hands-on experience with these plants and their effects. She wasn't just copying from ancient texts. She was doing original research and experimentation, but even within the relatively protected space of monasteries and convents, there were dangers. Monks or nuns who became too interested in substances, who experimented too freely, or whose visions became too unorthodox, might be viewed with suspicion. There are cases of mystics being investigated for heresy when their substance-influenced visions led them to conclusions that challenged church doctrine. The medieval university towns like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford had their own drug cultures. Medical students learned about substances from texts and lectures, but they also experimented on their own. Young men with access to knowledge about drugs and, sometimes, access to the substances themselves definitely tested things out. There are amusing accounts in medieval student letters about experiments gone wrong. One letter from a student in Paris to his friend describes taking too much of some substance. He's frustratingly vague about what exactly and spending an entire day, convinced he could understand the language of birds. He describes this as a philosophical experiment and clearly thinks it's hilarious in retrospect, though he admits he was terrified at the time. Students also had access to street markets where substances were sold. University towns attracted all sorts of merchants and vendors, including those selling remedies of questionable origin and purity. Students with hangovers from excessive drinking might buy supposed cures from these vendors, not knowing or caring what was actually in them. The tension between academic medicine and folk medicine played out in university towns. Professors taught humoral theory and Galenic medicine from ancient texts. Meanwhile, poor students and townsfolk relied on local healers who used practical folk remedies. Sometimes the folk remedies worked better, which must have been embarrassing. For the learned physicians, let's talk about specific regional variations in substance use across medieval Europe. The Mediterranean regions had access to substances through sea trade that weren't available in Northern Europe. Spanish and Italian physicians could obtain exotic drugs from North Africa and the Middle East relatively easily. This gave them a different palette of substances to work with. Northern European medicine relied more heavily on locally available plants. The same basic plants, Sopium poppies, Henbane mandrake, grew across Europe, but regional traditions developed different preparations and uses. A remedy common in England might be unknown in Poland, even if both used similar base ingredients. The Celtic regions, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Brittany maintained older folk traditions that predated Christianity and persisted alongside Christian practices. These traditions included the use of various psychoactive plants in healing and ritual contexts. The boundaries between pre-Christian paganism and Christian folk practice were often blurry, especially when it came to healing and substances. There are Irish texts describing the use of certain mushrooms and plants for inducing visions during Druidic-influenced practices that continued in Christianized form. Whether these were actual continuations of pre-Christian traditions or later inventions claiming ancient authority is debated. But either way, they show psychoactive substances being used in spiritually significant contexts. Scandinavian traditions included the use of fly agaric mushrooms, the red mushrooms with white spots that look like they're from a fairy tale. These mushrooms contain muscimol and other compounds that cause hallucinations, euphoria, and sometimes terrifying experiences. There are accounts suggesting that Viking berserkers may have used fly agaric to induce their battle rage, though this is disputed by some historians. What's certain is that fly agaric was known and used in Northern Europe. The mushrooms were sometimes dried and consumed, sometimes prepared as drinks. Shamanic traditions among the Sami people of northern Scandinavia definitely included fly agaric, used for spiritual purposes. And these practices may have influenced medieval Scandinavian folk traditions. Eastern European traditions are harder to document because fewer texts survive, but archaeological and folkloric evidence suggests rich traditions around psychoactive plants. The steppe regions had contact with Asian and Middle Eastern drug cultures through trade routes, bringing different substances and practices into the mix. The Byzantine Empire, bridging Europe and Asia, had access to an incredible variety of substances. Constantinople was a cosmopolitan city where merchants from everywhere brought their goods, including drugs. Byzantine physicians had access to Greek medical texts that had been lost in Western Europe, plus knowledge from Persian and Arab medical traditions. Byzantine medicine was probably more sophisticated than Western European medicine for much of the medieval period. When Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, Byzantine scholars fled westward, bringing their texts and knowledge with them. This contributed to the Renaissance revival of classical learning, including medical knowledge about substances and their uses. Let's talk about the economics of the medieval drug trade more deeply. Opium, when available, was expensive. A small bottle of opium tincture might cost a laborer a week's wages. For the wealthy, this was pocket change. For the poor, it meant choosing between pain relief and feeding your family. This economic disparity meant that the poor relied on cheaper, more readily available substances. Wild-growing plants that anyone could gather were the medicine of the masses. Expensive imported drugs were for the elite. This created different substance cultures for different classes. The middlemen in the drug, trade merchants who imported substances, apothecaries who prepared them, physicians who prescribed them all, took their cuts. By the time opium traveled from the eastern Mediterranean to northern Europe and was prepared into a tincture by an apothecary and prescribed by a physician, its price had multiplied many times over. Some merchants made fortunes in the drug trade. The Medici family in Florence, who became one of the most powerful families in Europe, built their initial wealth partly on trading spices and medicinal substances. They had connections throughout the Mediterranean and into Asia, giving them access to rare and valuable drugs that they sold at premium prices to wealthy clients. Apothecaries in major cities became wealthy and influential. A successful apothecary in London or Paris might own multiple shops, employ numerous assistants, and have noble clients who relied on his preparations. These were skilled professionals who guarded their formulas jealously and trained apprentices in the art of pharmaceutical preparation. But there were also street-level dealers vendors who sold cheap remedies of questionable quality to poor customers who couldn't afford legitimate apothecaries. These remedies might be ineffective placebos, or they might be dangerously contaminated or misdosed. Buyer beware in the medieval drug market. The regulation of the drug trade varied by location. Some cities had guilds of apothecaries that tried to maintain standards and control who could sell medicines. Other places had no regulations at all. The Holy Roman Empire issued some edicts trying to regulate medicine sales, but enforcement was spotty at best. There were also traveling medicine sellers, medieval predecessors of the snake oil salesman. These characters would roll into town, set up a stage, and put on a show advertising their miraculous remedies. They'd make extravagant claims, sometimes staging fake cures with Confederates planted in the crowd, sell their bottles of whatever, and move on to the next town before people realized the stuff didn't work. Some of these traveling sellers were complete frauds. Others were selling legitimate remedies but exaggerating their effectiveness. A few actually knew what they were doing and provided genuine service, especially in remote areas that didn't have resident healers or apothecaries. Let's talk about specific cases of substance-related crimes from medieval court records, because these give us glimpses into how this stuff actually played out in people's lives. In 1302 in London, a woman named Alice was brought before the court accused of selling fake medicine. She had been selling what she claimed was a universal cure for fever, claiming it contained exotic spices and rare herbs. When authorities inspected her operation, they found she was just selling colored water with some common herbs. She was fined and banned from selling medicines. But the case shows that medical fraud was common enough to warrant prosecution. In 1389 in Frankfurt, a physician named Wilhelm was accused of murder when his patient died after taking medicine Wilhelm had prescribed. The medicine contained opium and mandrake, and apparently the dose was too strong. Wilhelm argued that he'd followed standard procedures and the patient must have had unusual sensitivity to the medicine. The court ultimately dismissed the charges, setting a precedent that physicians couldn't be held liable for deaths from properly prepared medicines given in good faith. This was actually an important legal development protecting physicians from prosecution when their treatments failed. In 1456 in Venice, a scandal erupted when it was discovered that several apothecaries had been colluding to fix prices on imported opium and other expensive drugs. They'd created a cartel that controlled supply and kept prices artificially high. When the conspiracy was exposed, the city authorities came down hard. The ringleaders were heavily fined. Their shops were temporarily closed. And new regulations were put in place to prevent future price fixing. The case shows that economic crimes around drugs weren't just a modern phenomenon. Medieval authorities took market manipulation in essential medicines seriously. There's a particularly dark case from 1412 in Paris involving a midwife named Jean, who was accused of using substances to induce abortions. Several women had died after visiting her, and their families brought charges. Under interrogation, which in medieval terms meant torture, Jean confessed to providing preparations containing pennyroyal, tansy, and other abortifacient herbs. She claimed she was only trying to help desperate women, but the court convicted her of murder. She was executed by burning. The case illustrates the dangerous position of women who provided reproductive health care and the brutal consequences when things went wrong. From 1375 in Barcelona. There's a fascinating case of a merchant who was caught smuggling undeclared opium and other drugs to avoid customs duties. Medieval cities imposed taxes on imported goods, and drugs were valuable enough that smuggling them was profitable despite the risks. This merchant had been bribing dock workers to look the other way while he brought in substantial quantities of opium, hidden among legitimate cargo. When caught, he lost his entire shipment, paid massive fines, and was banned from trading for 5 years. The severity of the punishment shows how serious authorities were about controlling the drug trade, not because of the drugs themselves, but because of the lost tax revenue. Let's talk about some of the weirder superstitions and magical beliefs around substances. Medieval people believed that the time and manner of harvesting plants affected their potency. Mandrake, as we mentioned, supposedly had to be harvested at midnight with specific rituals. But lots of other plants had harvesting superstitions to see John's wort, which actually does have mild antidepressant properties that modern science has confirmed. Had to be gathered on St. John's Day, June 24th at dawn, while reciting prayers. Medieval people believed this timing made it most effective against demonic influence and melancholy. Was the timing actually important? Probably not, but the ritual gave meaning to the medicine and strengthened belief in its effectiveness. Vervain, another plant with mild psychoactive properties, supposedly had to be harvested by moonlight by someone who had fasted for 3 days. The gatherer should wear white and approach the plant with reverence, asking its permission before taking it. These elaborate rituals served multiple purposes. They showed respect for the plant's power. They created a sense of sacred importance around medicine, and they probably helped ensure that only serious practitioners who had invested time and effort were gathering and using powerful plants. The belief in astrological timing for harvesting and preparing medicines was universal among learned physicians. Each plant was associated with a particular planet, and gathering or preparing the plant when that planet was ascendant supposedly increased its power. Mars-ruled plants like nettle should be gathered when Mars was strong. Venus-ruled plants like rose should be gathered when Venus dominated the sky. Did any of this actually matter pharmacologically? Almost certainly not. But it mattered psychologically and socially. It created a framework of meaning around medicine that helped both practitioners and patients believe in the effectiveness of remedies. And belief matters. The placebo effect is real and can be powerful, especially when reinforced by elaborate ritual and cultural expectations. Signatures and symbols were also important. The doctrine of signatures held that God had marked plants with signs showing their uses. We mentioned this earlier, but it goes deeper. Bloodroot with its red sap was good for blood disorders. Liverwort, whose leaves supposedly looked like a liver, was good for liver problems. Lungwort, with lung-shaped leaves, was good for breathing problems. This system was completely unscientific, but it accidentally led to discovering some genuinely useful plants. If you're trying every plant that looks like the organ you're trying to treat, you'll eventually stumble across some that actually work, just by chance. The doctrine gave medieval herbalists a framework for systematic experimentation. Even if the underlying theory was wrong, there were also beliefs about sympathetic magic-like cures, like if someone was bitten by a mad dog, the remedy might include something from a dog. If someone was stung by a bee, the remedy might include bee products. This thinking led to some bizarre preparations that almost certainly didn't work. But it also led to things like using bee venom for arthritis, which actually does have some therapeutic effect. The medieval period saw the development of increasingly complex compound medicines preparations with dozens of ingredients. Theriac, which was related to mithridate, but even more elaborate, supposedly contained over 60 ingredients including opium, viper flesh, cinnamon, myrrh, and everything else expensive and exotic the apothecary could think of. Preparing thoriac was a major undertaking. Some recipes required aging the mixture for years before it was ready to use. The most famous theriac came from Venice, where its preparation was a public ceremony attended by city officials to ensure authenticity. The ingredients would be displayed, mixed according to the ancient recipe, and sealed in jars to age. It was like watching a medieval pharmaceutical production line, except with more religious ritual and less quality control. Did theriac work? Well, the opium in it certainly did something. The rest of the ingredients probably didn't hurt, and the placebo effect of taking such an expensive, prestigious medicine prepared with such ceremony was undoubtedly powerful. Wealthy people throughout Europe swore by thoriac and paid outrageous prices for authentic Venetian preparations. The interesting thing about these complex medicines is that they reflect medieval thinking about healing. More ingredients meant more powerful medicine. Exotic ingredients showed the practitioner's knowledge and access to resources. The complexity itself was part of the therapeutic value if healing your illness. Required 60 ingredients mixed according to an ancient secret formula. Then your illness was being taken seriously and fought with appropriate weapons. Modern medicine tends toward simplification, finding the single active compound and using just that. Medieval medicine went the opposite direction. If one ingredient is good, 60 must be better. Neither approach is completely right or wrong. Sometimes complexity adds redundancy and multiple pathways to healing. Sometimes it just adds expense and potential for interactions between compounds. Let's talk about dreams and visions in more detail, because this was a huge part of medieval. Consciousness and substance use definitely played into it. Medieval people took dreams incredibly seriously. Dreams could be messages from God, warnings from angels, temptations from demons, or prophecies of the future. There were professional dream interpreters, usually monks or learned men, who could be consulted about troubling or significant dreams. They'd refer to dream interpretation manuals that codified what various symbols meant. Dreaming of water might mean one thing, dreaming of fire, another. These interpretations were taken as seriously as any other form of divination. Substances that affected dreams were therefore powerful tools. Opium, mandrake, henbane, and various other plants all influenced dream content, making dreams more vivid, bizarre, or memorable. Someone who took these substances before sleep would almost certainly have intense dreams, which they'd then interpret as meaningful. There are accounts of people deliberately inducing prophetic dreams before important decisions. A lord trying to decide whether to go to war might take a preparation designed to induce meaningful dreams. Sleep, and then base his decision partly on what he dreamed. Whether this is any worse than making military decisions based on which way a chicken bone falls, or what a priest says God told him, is debatable. Medieval decision-making had a lot more supernatural consultation than we're comfortable with today. Saints and mystics often reported receiving divine guidance through dreams and visions. Some of these were probably genuine spiritual experiences. Some were probably fabricated for political or religious purposes. And some were probably the result of fasting, sleep deprivation, and consumption of substances that affected consciousness. The medieval mind wouldn't have distinguished between these categories the way we do. We received guidance in a dream. It didn't matter whether the dream came from fasting, fungi, or divine intervention. The message was what mattered. Nightmares were particularly significant because they were often interpreted as demonic attacks. If someone had repeated nightmares, it might be seen as evidence of possession or curse. Remedies for nightmares included prayers, protective amulets, and also substances. Ironically, some of the substances used to prevent nightmares, like henbane, probably caused more vivid dreams. But if those dreams were interpreted more positively, that might have counted as success. Sleep paralysis, the phenomenon where you wake up but can't move and often hallucinate a presence in the room, was interpreted in medieval times as a visit from an incubus or succubus, demons who supposedly assaulted people in their sleep. Remedies for these attacks included prayers, protective symbols, and also herbal preparations. Again, the substances probably didn't prevent the sleep paralysis, which is a neurological phenomenon, but they might have affected how often it occurred or how it was experienced. The whole medieval understanding of consciousness was different from ours. They didn't see a clear boundary between waking and sleeping, between ordinary consciousness and altered states, between the physical and spiritual worlds. These realms interpenetrated each other. Substances that affected consciousness weren't just changing brain chemistry, they were opening doors between worlds, allowing you to perceive things normally hidden. This worldview made substance use spiritually significant in ways that modern secular society doesn't really have. Taking a drug wasn't just altering your neurotransmitter levels, was a potentially sacred or dangerous act that could bring you closer to divine truth, or make you vulnerable to demonic influence. Let's talk about gender and substance use in more depth. We've touched on this, but it's worth exploring further because gender shaped every aspect of medieval life, including drug use. Men, particularly educated men, had official sanction to study and practice medicine. University medical faculties were exclusively male. Physicians were male. The prestigious, well-paid aspects of medicine were male domains. These men could read Latin texts, debate medical theory, and prescribe expensive remedies to wealthy clients. But the actual hands-on practice of medicine, especially for common people, was often done by women. Midwives were exclusively female. Village healers were usually women. The people who actually grew, harvested, and prepared most remedies were often women. They had practical knowledge passed down through generations of female networks. This created a situation where women had extensive practical knowledge about substances, but no official authority. They couldn't attend universities or get medical licenses. Their knowledge was dismissed as folk medicine or old wives' tales, even when it was more effective than what university-trained physicians were doing. The church and secular authorities were deeply suspicious of women's medical knowledge, especially around reproduction and sexuality. A woman who knew how to ease childbirth, prevent pregnancy, or induce abortion was wielding power that threatened patriarchal control. This knowledge often involved psychoactive substances ergot for inducing labor, various herbs for preventing or ending pregnancy, opium, and other plants for pain relief during childbirth. The witch trials, which intensified in the late medieval and early modern periods, often targeted women with medical knowledge. Accusations would focus on their use of herbs and potions. Knowledge of psychoactive plants was presented as evidence of witchcraft. These women were supposedly using demonic power rather than natural medicine. But here's the thing. The substances these women used were the same ones monks and university physicians used. The difference was who was using them and what explanation they gave. A monk growing opium poppies in a monastery garden was preserving God's gifts for healing. A woman growing the same poppies in her cottage garden was potentially consorting with demons. The plant was the same. The interpretation depended on gender and institutional authority. Women's medical practice was also economically threatening. If women provided effective healthcare for free or cheap, that competed with male physicians who charged substantial fees. Some witch trial prosecutions were arguably economic warfare male practitioners using accusations of witchcraft to eliminate competition from female healers. Not all female healers were persecuted, of course. Many operated openly and were valued by their communities. Noble women often studied herbs and medicine as part of their household management duties. Queens and noble ladies maintained still rooms where medicines were prepared. This was acceptable because it was private, domestic, and appropriate to women's roles as household managers and caregivers. But any woman whose practice became too public, too successful, or too threatening to male authority risked accusations of impropriety or witchcraft. The same knowledge that made a woman a valued community resource could make her a target if the social context shifted. The gendered nature of medical knowledge meant that women's practical expertise was constantly being lost or suppressed. When a wise woman was executed as a witch, her knowledge often died with her. If she had daughters or apprentices who'd learned from her, they might be too afraid to practice openly. Centuries of accumulated practical knowledge about substances and their effects was lost because that knowledge was held primarily by women in a society that feared and suppressed female power. Let's talk about the intersection of substance use and sexuality in medieval times. Aphrodisiac substances believed to increase sexual desire or performance were sought after throughout the medieval period. The substances used as aphrodisiacs included some with actual physiological effects and some that were pure placebo. Mandrake was considered a powerful aphrodisiac, probably partly because of its humanoid shape and partly because it does have psychoactive effects that might increase disinhibition. Spanish fly, made from dried beetles, was used despite being quite toxic. It causes irritation of the urinary tract that was mistaken for sexual arousal. But it's actually just poisoning you. Various spices like ginger and cinnamon were considered stimulating. Oysters, which we still consider aphrodisiacs, were recommended in medieval texts. There's a whole category of magic focused on using substances to influence love and desire. Love potions were supposed to make someone fall in love with you. These typically combined symbolic ingredients like rose petals with psychoactive substances like mandrake. Did they work? Not at making someone genuinely fall in love, but the psychoactive components might make someone more relaxed, suggestible, or disinhibited, which could be mistaken for attraction. The ethics of love potions were questionable, even by medieval standards. Using a potion to make someone desire you against their will was recognized as problematic. Church authorities condemned the practice, but people still did it, especially young people desperate to win over an uninterested love interest. There are court cases involving accusations that someone used a love potion to seduce or manipulate another person. These were taken seriously because consent was being questioned if someone only desired you because of a drug you gave them. Was that genuine consent? Medieval people didn't have modern frameworks for thinking about consent, but they recognized that there was something wrong about chemically manipulating someone's feelings. On the flip side, there were substances believed to suppress sexual desire, which were primarily used by monks, nuns, and others trying to maintain vows of celibacy. These anaphrodisiacs included various plants and also things like excessive fasting and sleep deprivation, which we now know decrease libido by affecting hormone levels. Whether these substances actually worked is doubtful, but the belief that they did probably helped. If you're a monk struggling with sexual thoughts and you take a bitter tea of certain herbs, believing it will help you maintain chastity, The placebo effect might actually reduce your distress even if the herbs themselves do nothing. The medieval church's complicated relationship with sexuality meant that substances affecting sexual desire were particularly fraught. Sexual pleasure within marriage for the purpose of procreation was acceptable. Sexual pleasure for its own sake was sinful. Anything that increased sexual desire outside of acceptable contexts was therefore potentially sinful. But anything that helped maintain chastity was praiseworthy. This created odd situations where the same substance might be condemned as an aphrodisiac when used by lay people, and praised as an aid to chastity when used by monastics, depending entirely on the intended purpose and the user's spiritual state. Let's explore some specific historical figures whose relationships with substances shape their lives and legacies. We've mentioned some already, but there are more fascinating cases. Paracelsus, who lived in the early 16th century, right at the end of the medieval period, was a physician and alchemist who revolutionized medicine. He was also, according to some accounts, a heavy user of opium and possibly other substances. He allegedly carried opium with him constantly and used it, both medicinally for patients and personally for himself. Paracelsus challenged many medieval medical assumptions. He argued that diseases had specific causes and should be treated with specific remedies rather than generic humoral balancing. He experimented extensively with chemical preparations, creating medicines that were often more effective than traditional herbal remedies. He was also arrogant, confrontational, and difficult to work with, characteristics that some historians speculate might have been influenced by his substance use. Whether Paracelsus was a visionary genius despite his drug use, because of it or independent of it, is impossible to determine. But his case shows how substances were part of the lives of even the most prominent medical figures of the era. Philippa of Hainault, Queen of England in the 14th century, had multiple difficult pregnancies and childbirths. Medical records suggest she was given substantial amounts of opium and other substances during labor. She successfully delivered 12 children, which was impressive in an era when childbirth killed many women. The pain relief provided by opium may have helped her survive repeated traumatic births. But there are also suggestions that Philippa developed dependence on opium after years of use during pregnancies and for chronic pain. Late in her life, she was described as frequently melancholy and withdrawing from court life. This could have been depression, physical illness, or possibly withdrawal symptoms from reduced opium use. We'll never know for certain, but her case illustrates how even queens weren't immune to the complications of substance use. Henry VI of England, who ruled in the 15th century, had periodic episodes of complete mental breakdown where he was catatonic and unresponsive for months at a time. Modern historians debate whether this was inherited mental illness, stress-induced psychosis, or possibly some theories suggest that treatments given to Henry during his episodes, which definitely included various psychoactive substances, might have made things worse rather than better. The treatments for mental illness in medieval times were brutal and often ineffective. They included bloodletting, forced vomiting with antimony, powerful purgatives, and various substances meant to restore humoral balance. For someone actually experiencing psychosis or severe depression, these treatments would be torture. The substances might provide temporary relief through sedation, but the underlying conditions weren't being addressed. Charles VI of France. Charles the Mad, whom we mentioned earlier, provides another case study. His madness began after he survived what might have been an assassination attempt by poison. Thereafter, he had periodic episodes of delusion, paranoia, and violence. Was his initial illness caused by poisoning that produced lasting brain damage? Or did he have a psychiatric condition that was then made worse by the various treatments, including heavy use of substances that physicians tried? Medieval medicine often couldn't distinguish between treating illness and causing it. The same substances that provided relief in proper doses became toxins in excessive doses or with long-term use. Patients suffering from the side effects of their medicines might be given more medicines to treat those side effects, creating cascading problems. Let's talk about some of the lost knowledge from the medieval period. Much of what medieval healers knew about substances was never written down, existing only in oral tradition. When healers died without passing on their knowledge, it vanished. When entire communities were wiped out by plague or war, their medical traditions died with them. There are tantalizing references in medieval texts to substances and preparations, whose identities we can no longer determine. A text might mention the red powder from the East that causes visions and eases pain, without specifying what plant or substance this actually was. Sometimes we can make educated guesses based on context, probably opium. Maybe something else, but we can't be certain. Some medicinal traditions from the medieval period survived in folk practice long after formal medicine moved in different directions. Rural healers in parts of Europe continued using medieval remedies into the 19th and even 20th centuries. Ethnobotanists and medical historians have worked to document these surviving practices before they disappear entirely. There's a bittersweet quality to this lost knowledge. Some of it was genuinely useful, effective remedies that we've had to rediscover through modern research. Some of it was ineffective or harmful, but all of it represented centuries of human experience, experimentation, and accumulated wisdom about how plants and substances affect the human body and mind. The modern pharmaceutical industry owes more to medieval herbalism than it usually acknowledges. Many modern drugs are derived from plants that medieval healers used. Aspirin from willow bark, digitalis from foxglove, morphine from opium poppies, tropine from belladonna. The medieval healers didn't understand the chemistry, but they identified the plants and figured out practical uses through generations of trial and error. Let's talk about the transition from medieval to early modern medicine and how attitudes toward substances shifted. The Renaissance brought renewed interest in ancient texts and empirical observation. Physicians began to question medieval authorities and experiment more systematically. The invention of the printing press meant medical knowledge could spread more widely and quickly. But for ordinary people, medicine remained largely unchanged. Village healers still used the same plants and preparations their grandmothers had used. The substances available didn't change dramatically until global exploration brought new plants from the Americas and Asia. The discovery of the Americas introduced entirely new substances to European medicine. Tobacco, coca, and various plants unknown in Europe entered the pharmacologic repertoire. But this is getting beyond the medieval period proper and into the early modern era. The Protestant Reformation disrupted medieval medical traditions in complex ways. Protestant regions rejected Catholic practices around saints, relics, and pilgrimages that had been intertwined with healing practices. This forced a rethinking of what medicine was and how it should be practiced. But again, for most people, the practical aspects of using herbs and substances for healing continued, largely unchanged regardless of theological shifts. The early modern witch trials, which peaked in the 16th and 17th centuries, were in many ways the death knell for traditional women's healing practices. The combination of religious paranoia, gender politics, and social stress created an environment where women with knowledge of herbs, especially socially psychoactive ones, were in extreme danger. Thousands of women were executed as witches. And while not all were healers, many were. The knowledge they held about substances and their uses died with them. This represents one of the great losses of medical knowledge in European history, driven by fear and misogyny rather than any rational evaluation of whether their practices were effective or harmful. Asterisk. By the 17th and 18th centuries, medicine was increasingly becoming professionalized, regulated, and male-dominated. women were systematically excluded from formal medical education and practice. The folk healing traditions that had preserved and transmitted knowledge about substances for centuries were suppressed or driven underground. Let's bring this full circle and think about what we can actually learn from medieval substance use. First, humans have always sought to alter consciousness and relieve suffering. This impulse is universal across cultures and time periods. The substances change, the social contexts change, but the fundamental human motivations remain constant. Second, the boundary between medicine and other uses of psychoactive substances has always been blurry. Medieval people didn't distinguish sharply between treating physical illness, treating mental distress, seeking spiritual insight, and just trying to feel better. Modern medicine tries to maintain clear categories, but the human experience of why we use substances that affect consciousness resists neat categorization. Third, knowledge about substances is always embedded in social and power structures. Who gets to use substances? Who gets to prescribe them? Who gets to profit from them? Whose knowledge is legitimized and whose is suppressed? These are questions of power that were as relevant in medieval times as they are today. Fourth, the cultural context shapes the experience of substances profoundly. The same pharmacological effects can be interpreted as divine, demonic, medicinal, or recreational, depending on the framework of belief within which they're experienced. Medieval people's experiences with substances were filtered through their worldview, just as ours are filtered through ours. Finally, there's genuine wisdom in the medieval holistic approach that didn't separate body, mind, and spirit. Modern medicine's specialization and reductionism has brought enormous benefits. But we've also lost something valuable, the understanding that healing involves the whole person in their full context, not just treating isolated symptoms or body systems. The medieval period shows us an alternative way of thinking about health, illness, consciousness, and healing. It's not a way we'd want to return to. Medieval medicine was too dangerous, too limited by lack of scientific understanding, too embedded in oppressive social structures. But it offers perspectives that can enrich our thinking about these fundamental human concerns. When Brother Ildrick woke up in his herb garden after his ergot adventure, when Marguerite ground her mandrake root for Pierre's toothache, when countless unnamed people throughout the medieval period used substances to ease pain, seek visions, or just make it through another day, they were engaged in the same fundamentally human activities we still pursue. The tools have changed, the understanding has improved, but the core human needs and desires remain. The history of getting high in medieval times is, ultimately, a history of human vulnerability and resilience, of suffering and the search for relief, of the drive to transcend ordinary consciousness and touch something greater. It's a history written in monastery gardens and village cottages, in royal chambers and peasants' fields. In moments of desperate pain and ecstatic vision, it's messy, complicated, often tragic, occasionally transcendent, and thoroughly, completely human. And that's why it matters, why it's worth studying. Why we can look back across 7 centuries and see ourselves reflected in the experiences of people who got high in medieval times because they were us, facing the same fundamental challenges of being human, using the tools available to them, doing their best to survive, heal, and occasionally transcends the limitations of ordinary existence. So here's to them. Here's to every medieval person who ever grew a poppy, ground a mandrake root, took a sip of wine, and wondered if it tasted strange, woke from a dream that felt prophetic, survived surgery they shouldn't have survived, or saw God in a vision that might have been ergot. They were doing their best with what they had. And sometimes that's all any of us can do. All right. We've journeyed deep into medieval consciousness, explored the pharmacopoeia of the Middle Ages, met fascinating historical figures, and hopefully learned something about both the medieval world and our own relationship with substances that alter consciousness. If you've made it this far, congratulations, you're now equipped with way more knowledge about medieval drug culture than you probably ever expected to have. Before you go, subscribe to Dreamless Timelines if you haven't already. We've got so much more fascinating history content coming your way. Hit that like button to let the algorithm know that deeply researched, nuanced historical content is what people want. And leave a comment sharing your biggest takeaway from this journey through medieval pharmaceutical adventures. What surprised you most? What do you want to learn more about? Thanks for spending these hours with me exploring what getting high was like in medieval times. It's been a trip literally and figuratively through one of the most fascinating and misunderstood periods of human history. Until next time, stay curious, question everything you think you know about the past, and maybe appreciate modern medicine just a little bit more, while also recognizing that our ancestors were smarter and more sophisticated than we often give them credit for. Dreamless Timelines, where history gets weird, wonderful, and thoroughly researched. Peace out.